Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hello, my dear friends. We're stepping into a world where your great-great-great-grandparents were casually altered almost every single day, and nobody thought it was weird. Picture this. It's the year 1250 somewhere in the English countryside. You wake up in a cold stone cottage. Your teeth ache. Your joints scream. Someone's coughing blood in the next room. Probably consumption, probably going to get worse. And what do? You shuffle down to the market, hand over a few coins, and the apothecary hands you a small vial of murky liquid that tastes like burnt flowers mixed with old leather. You drink it. Within an hour, the pain doesn't go away, but you genuinely don't care anymore. The world softens. Colors seem slightly more interesting. Your neighbor walks by and you find his hat absolutely hilarious, for reasons you can't quite explain. Welcome to medieval pharmacology, where being high wasn't a moral failing. It was just called taking your medicine. You probably won't survive learning how casually toxic these substances were, how children received them without question, and how an entire civilization built its healthcare system around drugs that would get you arrested the moment you tried them today. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're settling in from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval medicine wasn't some backwoods catastrophe waiting to be laughed at. It was in many ways a coherent system built on the best understanding available at the time. And that system absolutely depended on drugs. Lots of them. You see, when you don't have antibiotics, when you don't have anesthesia in any reliable form, when pain is simply part of existence, you get creative. You get very, very creative. The medieval physician, the herbalist, the cunning woman in the forest, they were all in some sense running the ancient equivalent of a pharmaceutical laboratory. And they knew their stuff. They knew that certain plants made you numb. They knew others made you hallucinate. They knew that some would kill you and some would save you. And often the difference was just the dose. That knowledge came from centuries of trial and error, passed down through generations, written into herbals and medical texts, whispered from master to apprentice. It was sophisticated, it was real, and it was built on substances that would genuinely blow your mind. Here's the thing that gets most people. Nobody was ashamed of this. There was no war on drugs. There were no pamphlets warning children about the dangers of poppy juice. When you had a toothache that made you want to scream until your voice gave out and the only thing that helped was opium. You took the opium. You thanked God for the opium. You called it a miracle of creation. And you'd do it again tomorrow if the pain came back. Which it would, because medieval dentistry was basically just wait for the tooth to fall out, or have someone yank it with pliers. The pleasure, the altered consciousness, the softening of reality. These were bonuses, side effects that nobody minded, because the main effect was that your suffering got bearable. And this matters because it changes how you understand the entire period. You can't look at a medieval monastery and think of it as this austere, sober place where monks did nothing but pray and work. Some of those monks were definitely getting their consciousness altered on a regular basis. You can't look at a medieval noble court and imagine it as this politically serious space where every decision came from a clear head. These people were mixing consciousness-altering substances into their wine, their spices, their medicines, their foods. You can't even look at medieval religious experiences the same way. Once you understand that some of those visions people had, the ones they swore came from God, might have been helped along by whatever alkaloid-rich plant they'd consumed that morning. The substance landscape of the medieval period was vast. There was opium from the poppy plant, pressed and processed and turned into laudanum, which was basically just opium dissolved in alcohol, often sweetened with honey or sugar. There was cannabis, which medieval physicians understood to be a legitimate medicine, despite having absolutely no idea how it actually worked in the brain. There was alcohol, which was everywhere and everything, all the time, not just for pleasure, but because it was the most reliable way to preserve food and create nutrition in a world without refrigeration. There was mandrake, which was so psychoactive that medieval people built entire mythologies around it. convinced that the root shaped like a human body actually screamed when you pulled it from the ground. There was henbane and datura, which made you hallucinate so intensely that users literally believed they were flying, that they were attending witches' sabbaths, that they had transformed into animals. There was hemlock, nightshade, belladonna, beautiful plants, all of them capable of killing you with a fingertip's worth of contact. And yet medieval chemists and healers kept working with them anyway, because the medicinal potential was worth the risk. The really wild part, the part that should make you feel slightly unsettled, is how normalized all of this was. Imagine living in a world where a significant portion of the population was at any given moment mildly intoxicated. Not drunk necessarily, not hallucinating usually, but slightly chemically altered. The pain's a little less sharp. The cold doesn't bite quite so hard. Anxiety about whether the crops will grow, or whether you'll survive the winter, doesn't feel quite so immediate. That softening, that cushioning of consciousness was constant. It was ambient. It was the normal state of being alive. You might have received opium in your breakfast porridge without even being told. Your mother might have given it to you as a child to keep you quiet while you worked. Your grandmother might have mixed it into a tea to help you sleep. Your doctor, the apothecary, the physician, the herbalist would have offered it as the first solution to almost any problem. Pain, opium, insomnia, opium, diarrhea, opium, anxiety, a mixture of alcohol and herbs, possibly with opium, agitation, poppy juice, restlessness, the same. It's almost funny in a dark way. The medieval solution to almost every problem was some variation of put opium or alcohol into your body and see what happens. And it worked in its way. It didn't cure anything usually, but it made everything more bearable. And that's where we're starting. Not with judgment, not with the modern assumption that all this was backward and foolish, but with understanding that your medieval ancestor lived in a fundamentally different chemical reality than you do. Their world was one where altered consciousness was medicine, where it was normal, where it was necessary. And before we explore all the specific substances, all the wild plants, and all the ways people used them, you need to understand that foundation. Medieval people got high like this. Not because they were hedonists or addicts by modern standards, though some of them definitely were, but because it was how medicine worked. It was how medicine worked. It was as how pain management worked. It was how society functioned. And honestly, it's kind of remarkable that nobody thought to call it a problem until very recently. You're standing in a field just outside a small medieval town, and it's early summer. The poppies are blooming brilliant reds and pinks against the green grass, nodding gently in the breeze. They're beautiful, almost delicate, and absolutely nobody who walks past them is thinking about beauty. They're thinking about what's inside, because inside those petals, as they dry, and age is opium. And opium is power. It's relief. It's sleep when sleep won't come. It's existence without pain. The poppy plant, Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy, had been cultivated in the Mediterranean and Middle East for thousands of years by the time the medieval period rolled around. The ancient Sumerians knew about it. The Egyptians used it. The Greeks and Romans built their entire pain management system around it. By the time we get to the medieval period, poppy wasn't some exotic drug. It was the foundation of medicine. It was as normal as aspirin is to you, except that aspirin doesn't actually make you high. And opium definitely does. Here's how it worked. A medieval farmer would grow poppy plants. They're not hard to grow. They're actually quite pleasant to cultivate. When the poppy flowers fell away and the seed pods started to mature, the farmer would make small incisions in the pod. A milky white sap would ooze out. You'd let it sit there exposed to air, and it would darkening from white to brown, thickening into a paste. That paste was raw opium. You could scrape it off, dry it further, and use it as is. Or, much more commonly, you dissolve it in alcohol to make what was called laudanum. Laudanum was the medieval wonder drug. It was packaged, distributed, sold, prescribed, and self-administered constantly. The beautiful thing about laudanum from the medieval perspective was that it did multiple jobs at once. The alcohol would preserve the opium. The alcohol itself had its own. intoxicating and pain-relieving properties. And if you sweetened it with honey or sugar, which was expensive but not prohibitively so, for people who needed medicine, you got something that actually tasted okay. People would drink it, and within an hour or so, depending on how much they'd consumed and how much they'd eaten, the effect would begin. The pain would dull, the anxiety would soften. If they'd taken enough, they'd become dreamy, slightly disconnected, their thoughts moving slowly like they were moving through water. Really high doses would put you to sleep. Deep sleep, the kind that lasted for hours and felt almost sacred if you were someone who usually slept in fits and starts on a thin mattress in a freezing room. The opium poppy itself was probably being cultivated throughout medieval Europe, in monastery gardens and in apothecaries, special plots. But there was also massive trade from the Middle East. Muslim physicians had centuries of experience with opium. They'd written elaborate medical texts explaining how to use it, how much to give, what conditions it could treat. When crusaders and merchants traveled to the Middle East, they came back with not just the physical plants, but with all this accumulated knowledge. Suddenly, Europe had access to both the substance and the sophisticated pharmacological understanding of how to use it. Laudanum, from the Arab physicians, became something of a status symbol. The good stuff, the expensive stuff, the stuff prepared, according to the proper recipe by someone who knew what they were doing. And this is where we hit our first quirky tidbit. Medieval physicians believed that opium worked by cooling the body. Remember, medieval medicine was all built on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Everything was hot or cold, wet or dry. Opium was cold and wet. If you had a fever, which was hot, opium would cool you. If you had inflammation, hot, opium would cool you. If you had pain, which was thought to involve an imbalance in heat, opium would cool you. They didn't understand endorphins, didn't understand opioid receptors, didn't understand that opium actually works by literally binding to receptors in your brain that evolved to respond to your body's own pain-relieving chemicals. But they understood that it worked, and they understood that you could dose it carefully. Too little and it didn't help. Too much, and the patient would sleep so deeply that they might not wake up. Get that balance right, and you had a medication. Opium was given to almost everyone at some point. Children received it constantly, not in huge doses, but regular small doses to keep them quiet, to help them sleep, to ease teething pain. Mothers gave it to their infants. The medieval world didn't have the concept of addiction, didn't think about dependency. Didn't worry that regular opium use might create long-term changes in a developing brain. They just knew that when a baby was screaming and the mother was exhausted, a little poppy juice was the solution. A few drops in the mouth and the baby would calm down, fall asleep, sleep through the night, and everybody benefited. Soldiers received opium before battles. Not before, actually, but during. You'd be wounded, screaming, and someone would give you laudanum to drink. It would reduce the pain enough that you could function, could continue fighting, or could at least not die from shock and suffering, while they dealt with the immediate crisis. Physicians gave opium to patients before surgery, such as it was in the medieval period, if they needed to set a bone or lan, say a boil or do something that involved deliberately causing pain. They'd give laudanum first. You'd drink it, and within an hour you'd be in a dreamy state where the pain of the procedure didn't seem quite real. You might not even remember it clearly afterward. The nobility were particularly enthusiastic about laudanum, not just for medical purposes, though obviously for those too, but because the wealthy could afford to keep a supply on hand and use it more liberally. A noble might have a servant bring them laudanum in the evening to help them sleep. They might use it to get through anxiety before an important negotiation. They might give it to each other as a gift. Here, I've acquired the finest laudanum from Venice. You must try it. There's even evidence that some nobles started using it recreationally, taking more than they actually needed just to experience the altered state. Historians still argue whether the medieval aristocracy constituted anything like a drug-using subculture, but the evidence suggests at least that some of them were definitely using opium for reasons other than straightforward pain relief. The apothecaries, the people who made and sold laudanum, became wealthy and respected. They had to be skilled. They had to know how to extract opium properly, how to combine it with alcohol, how to store it so it didn't degrade. They had to know dosing. They became part chemist, part doctor, part pharmacist. And they were in demand constantly. Every town of any size had an apothecary. Every noble had access to someone who could provide laudanum. And the substance moved through the supply chains of medieval Europe like an invisible river. You could trace the history of medieval trade partially through the flow of opium coming from the Middle East, moving through Venice and other trading cities, spreading up into the rest of Europe. But here's the thing that really gets you when you think about it. Medieval people didn't understand addiction the way we do, or rather, they knew it existed. They knew that some people kept taking opium beyond what was necessary, that some people craved it intensely if they tried to stop, but they didn't have a moral or legal framework to condemn it. If you were addicted to opium, well, you'd need your opium. That was just how it was. It wasn't a moral failing. It wasn't a legal problem. It was just another aspect of human suffering. Something you accepted and managed as best you could. And if you had the money to keep yourself supplied with laudanum, then that was just your life. You existed in a state of mild to moderate opium intoxication, and everything you did was filtered through that lens. The physical experience of opium intoxication, even if people back then wouldn't have called it that, was remarkably similar to what people experience today. You drink the laudanum and wait for it to hit. The come-up would take maybe 30 minutes to an hour. At first, you might feel slightly warm, a gentle flushing in your face. Your pupils would shrink. Your skin might itch slightly, the histamine released from the opium, triggering a response that medieval people had no name for, but that they definitely felt. Then the pain would start to recede. The sharpness would fade from whatever was hurting. A dull ache would become diffuse and manageable. Your thoughts would slow down. The world would become less urgent. If you'd taken a moderate dose, you'd be able to function. You'd work, you'd talk, you'd engage with your day, but you'd be doing it through a veil of gentle unreality. You'd be less bothered by things that normally bothered you. You'd find small things more interesting or amusing. Your sense of time would stretch and compress strangely. If you'd taken a larger dose, which was easy to do cause dosing was pretty much guesswork, you'd become drowsy. Your eyelids would feel heavy. The world would seem to recede further away. Words would become harder to form. You'd want to sit down, to lie down, to just exist in a warm, pleasant stupor. And if you surrendered to that, you'd fall asleep. That sleep would be deep, genuine, restful in a way that sleep on a lumpy straw mattress in a cold room usually wasn't. You might sleep for hours and hours. You might wake up and have the vague sense that you'd slept through something important, but you'd also feel like you'd actually rested, which was remarkable. And the thing is, for someone living in the medieval period, this was incredible. This was medicine doing exactly what you wanted. You had pain. It was gone. You had anxiety. It was manageable. You had insomnia solved. You had the screaming horrors of your life, the constant cold, the hunger, the threats, the filth, the disease. And opium let you step outside of all that for a while. It let you exist in a softer world. Of course, people wanted it. Of course, they used it constantly. Of course, some of them couldn't imagine living without it. You're walking through a monastery in the year 1300, and there's a peculiar smell in the air. It's the smell of fermentation, of yeast, of grain, breaking down into something new. Everywhere you look, there are barrels in the cellar, in the kitchens, stacked along the walls of the storage rooms. Because one of the medieval period's most important and most ubiquitous drugs was something that nobody thought of as a drug at all. Alcohol. Alcohol was everywhere. It was in everything. It was not a luxury or a vice. It was infrastructure. It was basic infrastructure, actually as basic as water systems or roads. Because while water was necessary for hydration, water was also frequently contaminated and would kill you with disease. So, you drank alcohol instead. Not drunk alcohol necessarily. Weak alcohol, small beer, and small ale. These weren't considered intoxicating beverages so much as nutritious drinks. They had maybe 1 to 3% alcohol by volume. You'd wake up and drink a bowl of small ale with your breakfast. You'd have some during the day. If you were working hard, you'd drink it instead of water, because it had some calories in it, and the water you had access to might be carrying dysentery or typhoid or cholera. Small ale kept you hydrated and gave you a slight nutritional boost and happened to have just enough alcohol in it that it killed some of the waterborne pathogens. But the beer and ale you drank in the evening, the ones you drank socially, the ones that were actually celebrated for their intoxicating properties, those were much stronger. A medieval beer might have been 5 to 10% alcohol. Medieval wine varied wildly, but often sat somewhere in the 8 to 15% range, sometimes higher, and people drank a lot of these beverages. A typical medieval peasant might consume a quart or more of ale per day. A medieval noble would drink wine constantly. Medieval noble would drink wine constantly. A soldier would be issued beer or ale as part of his rations, and he'd drink it steadily throughout the day and evening. The effect was that a significant portion of the medieval population was in a state of mild to moderate alcohol intoxication, pretty much all the time. Not drunk, but definitely tipsy, definitely altered. Their consciousness was chemically modified from morning to night by the constant consumption of fermented liquids. And this wasn't thought of as pathological. This was just how things were. This was normal. This was normal. You wouldn't have said someone was intoxicated if they'd been drinking ale all day. You'd just say they'd had a normal day of drinking. Alcohol did several things for medieval people. It hydrated them, even though it's technically a diuretic in weak forms. And with consistent hydration, it worked. It provided calories. Fermented grains broke down into simple sugars, and those were nutrition your body could use. It warmed you, literally. The vasodilation that comes with alcohol consumption would make you feel warm, which was important when you were constantly cold. And crucially, it altered your consciousness. It made unpleasant things less unpleasant. It made pain more bearable. It made the constant, low-level terror of medieval existence slightly less immediate. You'd work harder on a day when you were tipsy. You'd endure cold better. You'd sleep more easily. The monasteries were huge centers of beer and ale production. Monks didn't just drink alcohol for the same reasons everyone else did. They had additional theological justifications. The monastic rule, the code that governed how monks lived, often specifically allowed or even encouraged the consumption of alcohol. Some interpretations were that monks should be allowed to drink wine as a way of appreciating God's creation, as a way of celebrating the miracle of transformation. Grape to wine, grain to beer, or as a practical medicine. Monks got cold and sick just like everyone else. Alcohol helped. So monasteries had enormous breweries. They'd produce hundreds of gallons of beer per year. It was distributed to the monks, obviously. But it was also sold or given away as part of the monastic mission to serve the community. The thing about alcohol is that it's a drug that changes how you think and feel, and it does so quickly. Medieval people understood this intuitively, even if they didn't have the vocabulary to describe it. They knew that alcohol made you braver. They knew it made you more talkative. They knew it made you more talkative. They knew it made you less concerned with social hierarchy or propriety. Under the influence of alcohol, a peasant might say something to a noble that would normally have gotten him beaten, and everyone would laugh it off as the alcohol talking. They knew it made pain more bearable. They knew it helped you sleep. And they probably had some sense that if you kept drinking it, you'd develop a tolerance and need more of it to get the same effect, but they didn't have a framework for thinking of this as a problem. Alcohol was also medicine in a more direct sense. It was used to dissolve other medicinal substances, opium for instance, or various herbs. It was used as a disinfectant. If you had a wound, you might pour alcohol on it, which would hurt like hell, but it would kill bacteria. You might drink alcohol before a painful procedure to numb yourself. You might use alcohol-based tinctures as your primary medicine cabinet. An herbalist or apothecary would create a whole range of alcohol-based extracts and tinctures, dissolving plants in alcohol to pull out their medicinal compounds. You'd keep these on hand and use them constantly. Wine was particularly valued, particularly for the wealthy. Wine was made from grapes which were expensive and labor-intensive to grow and harvest. Only the wealthy could afford wine regularly. so wine became a status symbol. A noble would drink wine, particularly good wine, as a way of displaying wealth and status. And because wine was expensive, and because it was intoxicating, sharing wine became a social ritual. You'd offer wine to guests. You'd share wine at celebrations. Wine would mark important moments. And because you were regularly drinking wine, particularly strong wine, you were regularly intoxicated. The effect of all this constant ambient intoxication on medieval society is something historians still argue about. On one hand, there's the perspective that constant low-level intoxication made people more docile, more accepting of their lot, less likely to revolt. Against the feudal hierarchy that kept them in poverty, they were slightly numb to suffering. On the other hand, there's the argument that the constant access to alcohol and to the social bonding that happened over shared drinking actually created more cohesion in medieval communities. People drank together, they celebrated together over alcohol, they formed bonds over shared consumption. And in a world without television or movies or organized entertainment, getting drunk together was entertainment. Getting drunk together was entertainment. It was how you had fun. Here's a quirky detail that most people don't know. Medieval people weren't actually that great at distinguishing between different types of fermentation. Beer and wine and ale were understood as different things, but the line between them was blurry. You might make something that was kind of between beer and wine.
You might ferment honey instead of grain or grapes and get mead. You might ferment fruit juice and get something alcoholic, but not quite wine.
The point is that there were many different fermented beverages available, and almost all of them had some alcohol content. A medieval person, living in almost any context, had access to intoxicating beverages. The strength of alcohol varied tremendously, based on the skill of the person making it, the conditions they made it in, and how long they let it ferment. A medieval brewer or vintner was in many ways running experiments in chemistry without understanding chemistry. They knew from experience that certain things produce stronger drinks. They knew that warmer conditions might help fermentation happen faster or more thoroughly. They knew that the type of grain or fruit mattered. They were developing sophisticated brewing and winemaking techniques through trial and error. Some of the medieval ales and wines they produced were probably genuinely quite good. Others were probably barely drinkable, but had enough alcohol to serve their purpose. And the purpose was very real. Alcohol worked. It solved problems. It made life more bearable. It provided nutrition. It was medicine. It was food. It was social glue. It was anesthetic. When you had it available, you used it. And when you used it regularly, you became dependent on it, though nobody thought of it that way. You just needed your ale. Your body had become accustomed to it. The world felt right with alcohol in it, and wrong without it. But this wasn't seen as a problem. It was seen as normal. One of the really wild things about medieval alcohol culture is that children participated fully. Children would drink ale. They'd drink wine. They'd get intoxicated. This wasn't considered harmful or inappropriate. It was just how things were. A child doing farm work would have small ale available to drink just like the adults. A noble child might be given wine with meals the same as the adults. The effects, the slight giddiness, the clumsiness, the emotional looseness were just accepted as part of childhood. Historians still debate whether the constant alcohol exposure in childhood had permanent effects on medieval brains, but it definitely happened. Medieval children were regularly intoxicated in a way that would horrify modern parents. So when you're trying to understand the medieval period, when you're trying to imagine what it was like to live in that world, you need to imagine that your baseline consciousness was slightly altered, that everyone around you was slightly altered, that society functioned at a low hum of alcohol intoxication. The negotiations between nobles happened with both parties. Having had multiple cups of wine, the work of the fields happened with people having had several bowls of ale. The work of the fields happened with people having had several bowls of ale. Religious services happened with monks who'd had wine at breakfast. Everything was filtered through this lens of constant ambient intoxication. And it wasn't thought of as altered at all. It was just normal consciousness for the medieval world. You're in a medieval herbalist shop on a grey afternoon, and the herbalist is showing you something in the back, something that requires a certain kind of careful explanation. It's a jar containing a twisted, knotted root. It looks almost human, as if someone took a tiny person and shrank them down to the size of your hand. Arms akimbo, legs spread. The root is brownish, pale in places, weathered-looking. The herbalist looks at you solemnly and says, "Don't dig this one up yourself. If you hear it scream, it'll kill you." That root is mandrake, and the medieval mythology around it is one of the most fascinating things about medieval drug culture, because mandrake, mandragora in the scholarly texts, but mandrake to regular people, was real. It's a real plant. It's really psychoactive, and the medieval understanding of it was part genuine pharmacology and part pure folklore, woven together so tightly that it's sometimes hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. Mandrake grows throughout the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern regions. The plant has broad leaves and small purple flowers, and produces fruit that looks like little apples. But what people cared about was the root. The root of the mandrake plant contains tropane alkaloids, compounds that profoundly affect the central nervous system. They can cause hallucinations, they can cause delirium, they can cause physical sensations that feel completely real, but aren't, and they can kill you if you take too much. The line between medicinal and lethal is narrow. The line between therapeutic and dangerously hallucinogenic is even narrower. Medieval people knew all of this, even if they couldn't articulate it in modern chemical terms. They knew that mandrake root was powerful. They knew it could be used medically. There are medieval medical texts that describe using mandrake for pain relief, for inducing sleep, for treating various ailments. But they also knew it was dangerous, and that's where the mythology comes in. The idea was that the mandrake root, because of its humanoid shape, was actually a tiny person living in the earth. And when you tried to pull it up, this little person would scream. And the scream was so terrible, so literally deadly, that anyone who heard it would die. So you couldn't just pull it up by hand? You had to be clever about it. The recommended medieval method was to tie a dog to the plant and let the dog pull it up while you covered your ears. When the dog pulled the root free, it would scream. The dog would die. Sorry, dog. And you would be safe because you couldn't hear it. This is obviously not what actually happens when you pull up a mandrake. But the legend captures something true. The plant is genuinely dangerous, and you do need to be careful with it. Medieval people were describing a real hazard through the language of mythology. The scream might have been an exaggeration or metaphor for the toxicity of the root. Or maybe medieval people simply didn't have language precise enough to describe what they were experiencing, the terrible delirium, the physical symptoms, the sense of danger. So they expressed it as a scream. Medieval herbalists definitely cultivated mandrake deliberately. It wasn't a wild plant you accidentally found. It was something you grew in your garden if you were a serious herbalist because it was useful. You needed to know how to prepare it correctly. The root needed to be dried. It needed to be powdered or dissolved depending on how you wanted to use it, and you needed to understand dosing. Too little, and it wouldn't work. Too much, and you'd end up in a state of delirium that might not be survivable. What mandrake actually does to you is remarkable. The tropane alkaloids it contains, primarily scopolamine and hyoscyamin, though there are others, bind to two neurotransmitter receptors in your brain and central nervous system. They block acetylcholine, which is involved in everything from muscle control to memory formation to attention. The result is that taking mandrake produces an almost complete dissociation from reality. You hallucinate, you lose coordination, your pupils dilate massively, your mouth goes dry, your heart races, you might become agitated, or conversely, completely sedated. You might experience time distortion, you might have out-of-body experiences. You might genuinely believe that you're somewhere else entirely doing something completely different from what's actually happening. Medieval people who took mandrake medically in carefully controlled small doses would experience pain relief similar to opium, plus a sense of dissociation that might help them cope with painful procedures or just with the pain itself. They wouldn't hallucinate as intensely as someone taking a larger dose, but they'd definitely be altered. They'd be in a dreamy state. They'd be less connected to reality. But some people obviously were taking larger doses deliberately to experience those hallucinations. Medieval literature contains references to people taking mandrake deliberately to escape reality. Historians still argue whether medieval visionary experiences, mystical visions, reported by saints and holy people, were enhanced or partially caused by mandrake or other hallucinogens. But there's definitely evidence that it happened. A person seeking visions would consume mandrake. They'd lie down in a quiet place, and they'd wait for the visions to come. And come they would, vivid and overwhelming, and absolutely convincing. Because that's what mandrake does. There's also evidence, too, that mandrake was sometimes used not medically but magically. If you were an herbalist with a reputation for power, if you wanted people to think you had genuine supernatural abilities, you might use mandrake. You'd prepare it carefully. You'd give a small dose to a client who came to you seeking a vision or a revelation. Within an hour, they'd be hallucinating intensely. They'd believe they were flying or traveling to the spirit world or communing with the divine. They'd believe they were transformed, that they'd become animals, that they'd done impossible things. When they came back to normal consciousness, they'd report having had a genuine supernatural experience. And you, the herbalist, would have the reputation of being able to produce genuine visions. This was valuable. This was powerful. This was, in a sense, you providing a service. The medieval understanding of mandrake also involved a lot of sympathetic magic. Because the root looked human, medieval people thought it had human properties. They'd dress it up, they'd wrap it in cloth and treat it like a doll. They believed that the mandrake doll would somehow transfer its power to them if they possessed it. They believed that a mandrake root from a place where someone had been hanged and where the hanged man had literally marked the ground with semen or blood would have special properties. None of this made chemical sense, but it made magical sense. And in a world where the line between chemistry and magic was blurry, it made a kind of practical sense too. If you believed the mandrake doll gave you power, and that belief made you more confident, then you did have more power in a sense. The power came from your belief, not from the plant, but the effect was the same. Mandrake shows up in medieval literature constantly. It's referenced in medical texts, in magical grimoires, in legal cases where someone's been accused of using mandrake to poison someone else or to bewitch them. There's evidence that medieval magicians and cunning folk kept mandrake as a tool of their trade. There's evidence that medieval physicians prescribed it and understood how to dose it. And there's evidence that medieval people definitely believed in the mythology strongly enough that the belief itself became part of the effect. If you believed mandrake was dangerous and powerful and you took it, then of course you'd have a more intense experience. Your expectation would shape your perception of the drug's effects. The real horror of mandrake, and this is where it gets genuinely dark, is that it's genuinely toxic in ways that are hard to predict. The tropane alkaloid content varies by season, by where the plant is grown, by which part of the plant you are using. Medieval people didn't know this. They had to guess at dosing, and sometimes their guess at dosing and sometimes their guesses were wrong. Someone would take mandrake and end up in a state of delirium that lasted for hours or days. Their heart would race so dangerously that they might actually die. They'd experience such complete dissociation that they'd hurt themselves and not notice it. There are medieval accounts of people taking mandrake who essentially went insane, not temporarily, but for hours or days, in a way that was indistinguishable from genuine madness. Some people died, and the medieval response was generally to accept this as the risk of working with such powerful substances. What's really fascinating is how the mandrake mythology actually preserved important knowledge. The story about the screen killing you, that was essentially a way of saying this plant is dangerous, and you need to treat it carefully. The story about the humanoid shape giving it human properties, that was a memory aid, a way of saying this plant is special, unique, not like other plants. The recommendations about preparation and dosing, wrapped in magical language. Those actually contained practical information. Medieval culture was encoding pharmacological knowledge in the language of myth and magic because that was the most memorable way to transmit it. And the mandrake doll, the dressed-up root, kept as a magical object That might have actually had a practical purpose. If you had a mandrake root that you wanted to preserve, wanted to keep active, you might keep it wrapped and cared for. You might store it carefully. You might keep it in your sacred space, next to your other valuable objects. And the folklore about the doll having power was a way of saying, this is valuable, this is important. Treat it with respect. Don't waste it. Don't give it to just anyone. The magical language, in other words, was a way of controlling access to a dangerous substance. You're moving deeper into medieval pharmacology now, and we're getting into the really strange territory. You're in the garden of a wise woman, a hedge witch, someone with a reputation for knowing plants and knowing how they work, and she's showing you something truly alarming. She's pointing out plants that look innocuous enough, leafy plants with pretty purple flowers, berries that look almost appetizing. She's explaining in a calm voice that these plants will make you believe things that absolutely aren't true. These plants will make you think you can fly. These plants will make you think you're an animal. These plants will make you see things that aren't there and forget things that are. These are the nightshade alkaloids, henbane, datura, belladonna, and they are genuinely among the scariest substances that medieval people casually worked with. Because unlike opium, which is comparatively forgiving, or alcohol, which at least stays somewhat within predictable parameters, these plants are vicious. They're unpredictable, and they can absolutely completely destroy your connection to reality in ways that can feel like genuine insanity. Let's start with henbane, which is maybe the least scary of the three. Henbane, Hilsciamus niger, grows throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. It's a plant with funky-looking purple-veined flowers and a terrible smell. Medieval people knew it. They cultivated it. They used it medically and otherwise. The plant contains scopolamine and hyoscyamin, the same alkaloids that mandrake has, which makes sense because they're related plants from the nightshade family. The effects are similar: hallucinations, dissociation, fear, confusion, physical symptoms like increased heart rate and dry mouth. The way medieval people describe henbane is fascinating because it captures something real about the experience. They'd say it made you see things that weren't there. They'd say it made you feel disconnected from your body. They'd say it could make you violent or paranoid. And all of that is true for these tropane alkaloid drugs. The hallucinations are usually visual. Seeing things moving in your peripheral vision, seeing patterns that shift and flow, actually seeing full-on hallucinations if you take enough. But they can also be tactile. Feeling things crawling on your skin, feeling like you're being touched, or auditory. And the emotional tone is often fear or paranoia. These drugs can make you genuinely frightened, genuine convinced that something bad is happening, that you're in danger, that you need to escape. Datura is worse. Datura, sometimes called thorn apple or gypsum, is a plant so toxic that taking it is genuinely a game of Russian roulette. The alkaloid content varies wildly between planes, between seasons, between different parts of the same plant. You could prepare datura carefully and take a dose that produces manageable hallucinations, or you could prepare it the exact same way and take a dose that stops your heart. There's almost no way to know which one you're getting until you've taken it, and your body starts reacting. Datura users report believing that they can fly, and they report actually trying to fly, climbing towers or jumping off cliffs, because the hallucination was so convincing. They report believing they've transformed into animals. They report experiencing conversations with people who aren't there, and believing those conversations are completely real. They report being unable to distinguish between hallucination and reality for hours or even days. And here's the truly scary part. Datura causes anticholinergic delirium, which means you're not just hallucinating, you're delirious. Your consciousness is fundamentally broken. You might not remember what you've done while under its influence. You might hurt yourself without noticing. You might endanger others because you genuinely can't distinguish between what's real and what's not. Medieval people knew that datura was dangerous. There are medical texts warning against using it. There are legal records of people being prosecuted for poisoning someone with datura or other nightshade plants, and yet it was still used. Why? Because it worked. If you gave someone a small enough dose, They would hallucinate vividly without losing consciousness or dying. And people wanted that experience. People wanted to see visions. People wanted to escape their reality. There's evidence that some of the most famous medieval religious visions reported by saints, by mystics, by people who had reputations for genuine communion with the divine, might have been enhanced by or entirely produced by these plants. Imagine being a medieval person with profound religious conviction. Imagine wanting desperately to experience God directly, to have a vision. That proved your faith was justified. Now imagine having access to a plant that would produce absolutely convincing hallucinations. You'd take it. You'd prepare yourself spiritually and mentally. You take the plant and within an hour you'd be experiencing things so vivid, so overwhelming, so absolutely convincing that they came from God. When you sobered up and reflected on the experience, you'd remember it as genuinely divine, and you'd tell others about it, and they'd believe you, and you'd become known as someone who had genuine visionary experiences. And maybe, just maybe, the plant itself facilitated something real, made you access parts of your consciousness that were genuinely spiritual or profound. Historians still argue whether medieval mystics were using these plants. The evidence is circumstantial, but the botanical evidence is solid. These plants grow in Europe. Medieval people knew about them. Medieval people knew about them. Medieval herbalists had them in their collections, and medieval literature contains descriptions of visions that sound a lot like hallucinogenic experiences. Whether the visions were caused by the plants, or merely enhanced by them, or completely independent of them, is something that genuinely can't be determined anymore. But the possibility exists. Belladonna is maybe the most interesting because of how it was used, or rather how medieval people thought it was being used by witches. Belladonna, deadly nightshade, is genuinely toxic. It's beautiful. Glossy green leaves and dark berries that look attractive, but it's also one of the most dangerous plants in Europe. The berries contain scopolamine and hyoscyamine, and they're potent. Medieval people knew that witches supposedly used belladonna to fly to witches' sabbaths, to transform themselves, to have supernatural powers. And here's where it gets interesting. Medieval people might have been partly right. Belladonna contains tropane alkaloids that cause hallucinations and a sensation of weightlessness, of floating, of flying. If you took belladonna and hallucinated intensely, if your body felt strange and disconnected, if you had the sensation of floating or moving through the air, you might genuinely believe you were flying. And if you were already primed to believe in witches' sabbaths, cultural stories about witches flying through the air together with other witches, then your hallucination might conform to that narrative. You'd sober up, you'd remember it as a real experience, and if you reported it, especially if you were forced to confess during a witch trial, you'd describe it as witchcraft. You'd describe flying, you'd describe the Sabbath, and people would believe you, would think you were an actual witch, would potentially execute you. The truly dark part of this is that some of those confessions might have been people accurately describing drug experiences that they themselves had interpreted as witchcraft, or that they'd been tortured into framing as witchcraft. Someone ate belladonna, had terrifying hallucinations, and interpreted them as being transported to the witch's sabbath. They reported this. They were arrested. They were tortured. They confessed to being a witch, because that was the only frame that made sense for what had happened to them, and they died because of it. Medieval people also used these plants topically. There's evidence that belladonna was mixed into salves and rubbed on the skin. The tropane alkaloids absorbed through the skin. This is called transdermal absorption. A medieval herbalist didn't know the term, but they definitely knew the effect. A woman might apply a belladonna salve and then lie down in a dark room. Within an hour or two, she'd start hallucinating. She'd have sensations of flying or floating. She'd experience vivid visions. From tea outside, it would look like she was just sleeping. From the inside, she'd believe she was having supernatural experiences. And that was real to her. That was genuinely happening to her consciousness. The fact that it was caused by a drug rather than actual witchcraft doesn't make the experience less real or less profound. The tragedy of these plants is that they kill you unpredictably, and they make you unable to predict when they'll kill you, because you've lost connection to reality. Someone takes Datura, but the alkaloid content was higher than they thought. They start hallucinating. They think they can do things they can't actually do. They think they're in control when they're actually not. They might die of a heart attack while hallucinating. They might stop breathing because their autonomic nervous system is so disrupted that it forgets to tell their lungs to work. They might die because they tried to fly and hit something or got lost, or made a bad decision based on false beliefs about the world. Medieval records contain descriptions of people taking these plants and dying in inexplicable ways. Sometimes the explanation was witchcraft. Sometimes it was poison. Sometimes it was poison. Sometimes it was divine punishment. But often it was probably just the terrifying reality of messing with anticholinergic plants without understanding how dangerous they are. And here's the thing that makes medieval people kind of remarkable. They kept using them anyway. They knew these plants were dangerous. They knew people died. They knew the hallucinations could be terrifying. And they used them anyway because the potential benefits, pain relief, visions, the ability to escape reality temporarily, were worth the risk. Medieval medicine was essentially a game, where you weighed the known benefit of a substance against the known risk and you made your best judgment. And with these plants, the judgment, as often, yes, despite the danger, it's worth it. You're in a marketplace in a trading city, perhaps Venice or Alexandria or Baghdad, and merchants are dealing. There's fabric being sold, spices, metalwork, exotic goods from all over the known world, and woven throughout this trade network are plants and plant products, seeds and dried leaves, and resins. One of the most valuable commodities being traded is something that medieval Europeans didn't have to grow themselves: cannabis. Cannabis, also called hemp, also called hashish when processed into a concentrated form, was integrated into medieval culture across 3 entire continents. It grew in the Middle East. It grew in Asia. It was cultivated in some parts of Europe, and crucially it was understood as medicine, not as a recreational drug, not as a moral problem, but as a legitimate pharmaceutical substance. Muslim physicians had centuries of accumulated knowledge about cannabis. They understood its properties. They prescribed it. They understood dosing. And when Christian Europeans came into contact with Islamic medicine through crusades and trade, they encountered cannabis as a serious medicine, not as something disreputable. Here's the remarkable thing. Cannabis was legal in medieval Europe. It wasn't restricted. There was no war on drugs. People could grow it, process it, buy it, sell it, use it, without legal consequence. The plant was valued in multiple ways. Hemp fiber was used to make rope, cloth, paper, and the plant's flowers and seeds had psychoactive and medicinal properties that medieval physicians understood and utilized. The medical effects of cannabis were understood in terms of medieval medical theory. Cannabis was considered cold and moist, which meant it would help conditions involving excessive heat and dryness. It was used for pain, which makes sense because modern science has confirmed that. Cannabinoids actually do have analgesic properties. It was used for anxiety and stress. Medieval physicians noted that cannabis had calming properties, which again aligns with modern understanding. It was used for sleep, for digestion, for various conditions. A physician might prescribe cannabis in various forms, as a tincture dissolved in alcohol, as a decoction, a boiled preparation, as an oil infusion. The way medieval people used cannabis reflected their understanding of its properties. If they wanted a milder effect, they might take a single cannabis seed or a small amount of the flower. They understood that more would produce stronger effects. They understood that some people responded to it more intensely than others. They understood that you could build a tolerance if you used it regularly. They understood all of these things through observation and experience, even if they didn't have the molecular biology to explain why. There's a quirky detail that most people don't know. Some medieval herbalists and physicians used cannabis specifically because it was psychoactive, not in a recreational sense necessarily, but because the altered consciousness could be therapeutic. A patient with anxiety would be given cannabis to induce a state of calm and mild euphoria. A person with chronic pain would be given cannabis to shift their mental state so the pain was less psychologically oppressive. Someone with insomnia would be given cannabis to make sleep possible. The drug didn't cure the underlying condition, but it changed how the person experienced the condition. And for someone in medieval times with limited options for pain management or anxiety relief, that was genuinely helpful. Medieval literature occasionally contains references to cannabis use. There are accounts of physicians using it, of people using it for pleasure, of it being integrated into social setting. So it's not front and center the way opium sometimes is. Partly because opium was more famous and more universally valued, but also partly because cannabis is just less intense than some of the other substances we've talked about. It doesn't produce the dramatic hallucinations that mandrake or datura produce. It doesn't have the same obvious pain-relieving properties as opium. It's subtler. It's more of a gentle alteration than a dramatic transformation. But it was definitely there. And medieval people knew what it did. They knew it altered mood, reduced anxiety, made pain more bearable, produced mild euphoria, affected hunger and digestion, affected sleep. All of the things that modern people use cannabis for, medieval people were using it for too. The main difference is that there was no social shame around it, no legal consequence, no moral framework condemning it. It was just medicine. It was something you could use if you needed it. And if you wanted to use it for pleasure, that was probably fine, too. Though medieval sources don't make a big deal out of it. The trade in cannabis products, especially after processing into hashish in the Middle East, and then either consumed or further processed before being traded to Europe, was part of the larger medieval trade networks. Merchants would bring cannabis products back from the Crusades, from trading expeditions, from their contacts in Muslim-majority regions, and these products would be distributed through the apothecaries and physicians, becoming part of the standard pharmacological arsenal. What's interesting from a global perspective is that cannabis was simultaneously being used in medieval Europe, in the Islamic world, in Asia, and in Africa, all with similar understanding of its medical properties, and all with legal and social acceptance. This wasn't a plant that was condemned or restricted or seen as morally problematic. It was integrated into medical systems across multiple continents. Medieval people didn't have a concept of recreational drug use that was distinct from medical use the way we do. A substance either helped with something or it didn't. Cannabis helped with various things, so it was valuable. End of story. One of the things that strikes you when you study this period is how pragmatic medieval people were about psychoactive substances. They didn't have a moral panic about them. They didn't think using them was evidence of moral corruption or weakness. They understood that these substances had effects, that those effects could be useful, and that their job was to figure out how to use them safely and effectively. When someone got hurt using them, when someone overdosed, when someone had a bad reaction, that was unfortunate, but it wasn't grounds for condemning the entire substance class. It was just risk management. The medical texts preserved knowledge about cannabis. You can find references in herbals from various medieval sources, Islamic texts that were sometimes translated into Latin, European herbals that drew on Islamic knowledge, and the information is fairly consistent. Cannabis has certain properties, produces certain effects, is useful for certain conditions. Use it in appropriate amounts. Be aware that it affects different people differently. Don't use too much, or you'll have too strong an effect. Cannabis also shows up in the context of Islamic mysticism. Sufi mystics sometimes used cannabis as part of their spiritual practice to alter consciousness in ways that they believed facilitated spiritual experiences or communion with the divine. This wasn't seen as disrespectful or unspiritual. It was seen as another tool for accessing divine truth, and that perspective, that cannabis could facilitate spiritual experiences, might have influenced how evil Europeans thought about it too. Even in Christian contexts, there's some evidence that cannabis was sometimes used to facilitate visionary experiences, though this is less documented than it is for mandrake or other plants. The really remarkable thing is that cannabis persisted into the modern period without becoming controversial. It wasn't until the 20th century that cannabis became subject to legal restriction and moral condemnation. In most of the Western world in the medieval period, in the early modern period, in many places even into the 18th and 19th centuries, cannabis was just a plant with known medical properties. You could use it, buy it, sell it, grow it, It wasn't a problem, and that fact alone tells you something important about how medieval and early modern people related to psychoactive substances. They weren't inherently afraid of them. They weren't morally opposed to them. They integrated them into their medical systems and their daily lives with a pragmatism that's almost shocking from the perspective of someone living in the modern world. You're in a medieval apothecary workshop, and the air is thick with the smell of chemicals and dried plants. On the shelves are bottles and jars and dried herbs, arranged with meticulous care. But some of those jars contain things that are genuinely scary. Some contain plants so toxic that a fingertip of contact with them can kill you. Some contain preparations so dangerous that medieval physicians approached them with something approaching religious reverence. Hemlock, nightshade, belladonna, aconite. These plants are among the most beautiful and among the most lethal substances in all of medieval pharmacology. We've already talked about belladonna and nightshade as hallucinogens, but we haven't adequately captured the sheer horror of working with these plants. Because here's the thing, these plants don't have a graceful safety margin. With opium, you can misjudge the dose and probably be fine. You might get too sleepy, but you'll wake up. With alcohol, if you drink too much, you'll get sick, but you'll probably recover. With cannabis, even if you take more than you intended, the worst that usually happens is you get too intoxicated and uncomfortable. But with these tropane alkaloid plants, the nightshades, the safety margin is non-existent. You take a little too much, and you die. You touch the leaves wrong and toxins absorb through your skin, and you die. You handle the plant while also having a cut on your hand, and you die. The plant is beautiful and deadly, and working with it requires both knowledge and genuine bravery. Medieval physicians and herbalists knew this, and yet they kept using these plants anyway. Why? Because sometimes they worked. Because the potential benefits genuinely seemed worth the risk, and because medieval people had a different relationship with death than we do. Death was omnipresent. Death was always a possibility. If you had a chance to treat a serious condition, severe pain, advanced illness, something that was definitely going to kill someone, and you had a plant that might help but might also kill them, well, at least there was a chance. At least you were trying. Hemlock is particularly interesting because it's the substance that Socrates drank when sentenced to death by the ancient Greeks, but it was also used medically in medieval and ancient times. Hemlock is intensely toxic. It contains alkaloids that affect the central nervous system and paralyze muscles. A small amount can kill you. A medium amount can cause painful paralysis that lasts for hours before it stops your breathing. And yet, medieval physicians kept some on hand, because in very small doses, we're talking about doses so small that they are almost unmeasurable by medieval standards. Hemlock could have pain-relieving properties. And so the calculation was maybe this substance at this dose helps, maybe it doesn't, but maybe it does. Aconite, monkshood, is similarly deadly and similarly used. Aconite contains cardiac glycosides that basically attack your heart directly. Your heart stops or becomes arrhythmic. You die. And yet medieval physicians and herbalists kept aconite. There's evidence it was sometimes used in tiny amounts as a pain reliever or sedative, but mostly it seems to have been kept as a kind of last resort. If everything else had failed and someone was dying anyway, maybe aconite was worth trying. At least you were doing something. What's remarkable is the medieval acceptance of this. Physicians and healers kept these super toxic substances available. They used them occasionally. People died as a result, and nobody seemed to think this was grounds for condemning the practice. It was just medicine. Medicine was dangerous. Substances were dangerous. You did your best with limited knowledge. Sometimes it worked out, sometimes it didn't. Here's a quirky detail. Medieval physicians sometimes prepared these toxins in extremely dilute forms, almost homeopathic in their dilution. They'd make an extract of hemlock, then dilute it in alcohol or water repeatedly. They didn't have the concept of homeopathy, but they had a practical understanding that extremely small amounts of toxic substances might be safer to use. Modern science suggests that extreme dilutions of these substances would have no active ingredient left. The substance would be so diluted that there would be almost no poison in it. But medieval physicians were trying something that was at least moving in a safer direction. The way medieval people thought about poison versus medicine is also instructive. There wasn't a sharp distinction. A substance was poison if it hurt you in the dose you took it in. It was medicine if it helped you in the dose you took it in. The substance itself was morally neutral. It was the dose and the intention that mattered. And this logic meant that even the most toxic substances could be medicines in the right context. Belladonna specifically became associated with medieval witchcraft, and that association probably saved and destroyed lives in equal measure. On one hand, the association meant that belladonna was feared, which meant that people were more careful with it, and fewer deaths resulted from accidental overdose. On the other hand, the association meant that people confessed to using belladonna as evidence of witchcraft during witch trials, which led to executions of people who were essentially guilty of taking a drug. The fear that surrounded belladonna was legitimate. The plant is genuinely dangerous. But the fear was channeled through a supernatural framework rather than a rational one, and that supernatural framework had its own terrible consequences. Medieval tea.
X's on herbalism and medicine sometimes describe the harvesting of these toxic plants in terms that sound almost mystical.
You need to harvest at the right time of year. You need to gather under the right moon phase. You need to approach the plant with the right spiritual intention. Some of this is probably just old superstition, but some of it might have been practical advice wrapped in mystical language. The alkaloid content of plants varies seasonally. The right time to harvest might actually be when the moon is in a certain phase, if that corresponds to when the plant's alkaloid levels are optimal. The need for the right spiritual intention might have been a way of saying, you need to be calm and careful because this is dangerous. Medieval people were encoding pharmacological knowledge in mystical language because that language was memorable and powerful. There's also evidence that medieval people used some of these toxic plants topically, in ways that were actually safer than taking them orally. Belladonna salves, aconite liniments, inlock poultices, applied to the skin in limited amounts. These preparations might have had pain-relieving effects without the risk of systemic toxicity. The tropane alkaloids in belladonna, for instance, would absorb through the skin, but in smaller amounts than if the plant was consumed orally. The user would get the effect, pain relief, sedation, calming, without the same risk of overdose. Historians still argue about how often medieval physicians actually used these super toxic substances. The evidence suggests it was relatively rare. Hemlock, aconite, and some of the other most dangerous plants were kept available but used cautiously. But the fact that they were available at all, that physicians had them in their collections, that they seemed willing to use them when circumstances were desperate enough, tells you something important. Tea about medieval medical practice. It was willing to take risks. It understood that sometimes the risk of doing nothing was worse than the risk of using a dangerous substance. The trade in these toxic plants was also real. Merchants moved aconite and hemlock and other dangerous substances through trade networks. They were valuable because they were rare, because they were powerful, and because they were powerful, and because they could supposedly do things that other substances couldn't. And access to these substances was partly a marker of status and knowledge. If you were a physician or herbalist who had a reliable source of aconite or hemlock, that was impressive. That meant you had connections. That meant you had access to serious medicine. One of the things that's genuinely wild about this is that medieval people were working with some of the most toxic substances available anywhere in the plant kingdom. They were working with them while having no understanding of the actual mechanism of toxicity. And they were doing it anyway because they believed the potential benefit was worth the risk. That's either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. And it might depend entirely on whether the treatment actually worked or whether you died trying. You're a peasant sometime in the year 1400, and you're walking through the fields where your grain is growing. The crop looks good this year. The rye is tall. The wheat is developing nicely. But something's wrong. Some of the grain has a dark discoloration on it. The kernels look wrong, deformed, and you don't really think much about it because, well, grain's grain, right? You harvest it. You take it to the mill. It gets ground into flour. Your wife makes bread. You eat the bread. And then something very strange happens. Your neighbor starts convulsing, not like he's having a seizure, more like his limbs are acting without his control. He's jerking, thrashing. His muscles are contracting involuntarily. He's screaming that he can't control his body. Within hours, half the village is experiencing the same thing. People are contorting. People are having uncontrollable muscle spasms. Some of them are dying. And nobody understands why. Some people think it's a curse. Some think it's divine punishment. Some think witchcraft is involved. Actually, what's happened is that your grain was infected with ergot fungus, and the bread made from that grain has poisoned everyone who ate it. Ergot fungus, Claviceps purpura, grows on grain, particularly on rye. When conditions are right, the fungus colonizes the developing grain kernels and produces ergot alkaloids. These alkaloids are genuinely psychoactive. They're also genuinely toxic, and they caused one of the strangest epidemiological phenomena of the medieval period, ergotism, also called St. Anthony's fire, also called the dancing plague. Ergot poisoning is complicated because the effects vary depending on the dose and the length of exposure. Low doses produce hallucinations, convulsions, intense vasoconstriction that cuts off blood to your extremities, and other unpleasant symptoms. Prolonged exposure to ergot can cause gangrene of the fingers and toes. Very high doses cause the violent muscle spasms and convulsions that earn it the name dancing plague. People quite literally danced involuntarily because it was all mediated through chemistry rather than supernatural means. The medieval understanding of ergotism was completely mystical. Entire towns would be affected by what appeared to be a curse. Churches would be packed with people seeking divine intervention. Priests would perform exorcisms. People would pray. And sometimes, mysteriously, the outbreak would end. Why? Well, usually because the affected grain ran out and a new harvest of non-contaminated grain became available. But, from the medieval perspective, it looked like divine intervention. A saint would get credit for the healing, a shrine would become famous, and medieval people would develop increasingly elaborate explanations involving demons, witchcraft, and divine punishment. There's a really famous example from 1518 in Strasbourg. A woman began to dance uncontrollably in the street. Within a week, 34 people had joined her, dancing and convulsing uncontrollably. Within a month, more than 100 people were affected. They were dancing until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some of them collapsed permanently into comas, into death. The city brought in physicians. The physicians were completely baffled. Some of them actually suggested that the solution was more dancing, that if the afflicted kept dancing, the curse or whatever it was might somehow exhaust itself. Medieval medicine at its finest. The reality was probably ergot contamination in the bread supply. But the medieval mind interpreted it through a supernatural lens. This was divine punishment, or witchcraft, or demonic possession. And the cure was theological. Prayer, pilgrimage, the intervention of saints. Here's the truly remarkable part. Ergot fungus contains ergotamine and other alkaloids that are the chemical precursors to LSD. Medieval people were experiencing LSD-like trips, visual distortions, hallucinations, extreme states of consciousness, without having any idea what was causing them. They interpreted these profound mental alterations through a religious or magical lens. They experienced them as supernatural, and their interpretation became part of medieval culture and folklore. There's a scholarly debate about whether ergotism might have actually shaped medieval religious experiences, whether some of the famous visionary experiences reported by medieval saints might have been enhanced by ergot contamination, whether some of the most famous medieval outbreaks of religious fervor or mystical experience might have actually been ergot poisoning, and the evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. Ergot thrives in certain climates and in certain seasons. Medieval Europe experienced periodic grain contamination. Medieval people experienced periodic outbreaks of unexplained collective psychosis. The two sometimes line up. Did ergot cause the mystical experiences? Definitely sometimes. Could it have shaped religious history? Almost certainly. What's wild is that medieval people slowly became aware that this had something to do with the grain itself. Not that they understood the fungus or the chemistry, but they noticed that certain years the disease was worse, and those were years when the grain looked discolored or deformed. Some regions got good at identifying affected grain and separating it out. Some grain traders deliberately mixed contaminated and uncontaminated grain to stretch their supply, which had the side effect of poisoning whoever ate it. And some regions experienced recurring ergotism outbreaks because they had particular grain storage and handling practices that encouraged fungal growth. The medications that medieval physicians prescribed for ergotism were probably useless or harmful. They didn't understand the cause, so they couldn't address the actual problem. But some of the things they recommended, like getting the affected person to rest, to stop the compulsive dancing, to lie down, might have inadvertently helped. The real cure was discontinuing consumption of the contaminated grain. And once that happened naturally through the new harvest, the outbreak would end. Medieval people attributed the healing to divine intervention, or to the efficacy of prayers, or to the power of saints. The shrine would become famous. Pilgrims would travel to the shrine. They believed money endured. Offerings in the shrine would prosper. In some cases, this led to the perpetuation of the cult of saints who supposedly cured ergotism. And people would make pilgrimages to these shrines even after the ergot outbreaks had ended, maintaining faith in the saints' power even after the actual chemical cause of the disease had presumably been eliminated. There's also evidence that medieval people sometimes deliberately encouraged ergot-contaminated grain and used it for its psychoactive properties. This is speculative, but there are references in some medieval sources to people seeking out grain with specific kinds of contamination. And the possibility exists that they were doing this to access ergot psychoactive alkaloids. If true, this would mean medieval people were deliberately poisoning themselves with ergot to get high, which is almost unimaginably dark, but not actually inconsistent with what we know about medieval attitudes towards psychoactive substances. The legacy of ergotism in medieval Europe is weird and complicated. It caused suffering. It caused deaths. It caused entire villages to descend into apparent madness. It was terrifying. And yet it also shaped medieval culture and religious experience. Some of the most famous religious visions and divine interventions in medieval history might have been ergot poisoning. Some of the most important shrines might be there because of ergot. Some of the medieval understanding of the divine might have been influenced by the involuntary mystical experiences produced by ergot contamination. The truly remarkable thing is that medieval people had no way to understand what was happening. They were being exposed to extremely powerful psychoactive chemicals, and they were interpreting the experience through the only framework they had: theology and superstition. And that framework, while scientifically wrong, was internally coherent and allowed them to make some sense of experiences that would otherwise be completely inexplicable. You're in a monastery in the late afternoon and the monks are gathering for vespers. The air is thick with smoke, not from cooking fires, though that's happening in the kitchens. This smoke is aromatic. It's coming from the incense being burned during the service. The monks are chanting, their voices rising and falling in complex harmonies, and the incense is curling through the stone arches of the church. The smoke is frankincense, perhaps mixed with myrrh or other resins. It smells holy. It smells sacred. And it's also quite definitely putting the monks into an altered state of consciousness. Incense is one of the most interesting substances in medieval culture because it operates in a space between the sacred and the chemical. Medieval monks and priests used incense constantly. They burned it during services. They burned it in their private spaces. They burned it to mark sacred moments. And they did this partly because incense smelled good, partly for symbolic and religious reasons. And also, though this probably wasn't conscious, because the compounds in burning incense have psychoactive effects. The most common incense materials used in medieval Europe were frankincense from the boswellia tree, myrrh from the commiphora tree, and various other aromatic resins imported from the Middle East and Africa. When you burn these resins, they release volatile compounds into the air. People inhale these compounds. Some of them have pharmacological effects. Frankincense contains boswellic acids and other compounds. Some of these might have mild psychoactive properties, though the research on this is limited. But what frankincense definitely does is create a thick, aromatic smoke that has a physical presence. You're inhaling smoke all throughout a long church service. You're breathing in compounds that have at least some chemical activity. Combined with the chanting, the candlelight, the architectural grandeur of the church, the spiritual expectation, the fasting that many monks engaged in, you're creating a context where psychoactive effects, even if they're mild, would be amplified by psychological factors. There's a famous account from medieval sources of monks becoming intoxicated or euphoric from incense use, not completely incapacitated, but definitely altered. They'd be chanting and praying, and the incense would be thick, and they'd find themselves in a state of profound calm, of spiritual openness, of feeling like they were genuinely communing with the divine. Historians still argue whether this was the actual chemical effect of the incense, or whether it was psychological. The expectation of spiritual experience combined with fasting, sensory deprivation, repetitive chanting, and the authority of religious ritual. But the bottom line is that medieval monks were probably getting mildly intoxicated regularly as part of their religious practice, and they weren't doing it deliberately, or at least not consciously. The thing about incense is that it's so normalized, so integrated into religious practice, that nobody thinks of it as a drug. It's just incense. It's part of the liturgy, but the physical reality is that you're burning substances that have chemical properties and you're deliberately exposing yourself to the smoke. From a certain perspective, burning incense and inhaling the smoke is basically inhalation of a substance with pharmacological effects, not as powerful as smoking opium or cannabis, but still active. One of the stranger uses of incense in medieval times was as a delivery mechanism for other drugs. If you wanted someone to inhale a substance without them quite realizing it, you could put it into incense and burn it. Crushed mandrake, added to incense, would create smoke that was slightly hallucinogenic. Cannabis, added to incense, would create smoke that had psychoactive properties. Various resins with their own active compounds would combine, and the whole thing would be framed as sacred, as part of religious practice. There's evidence that some medieval churches used special incenses that had stronger psychoactive properties than the standard frankincense and myrrh. There are references in some historical sources to incense that produced visions, that made people euphoric, that induced spiritual experiences. Were these deliberately formulated? Were people intentionally creating modified incenses with stronger psychoactive effects? The evidence is circumstantial, but it's suggestive. If you were a medieval church leader and you wanted people to have profound spiritual experiences, one way to do that would be to use incense that had stronger psychoactive effects. The trade in incense materials was also a significant part of medieval commerce. Frankincense and myrrh came from the Arabian Peninsula and Africa. They were expensive. They were luxuries. Having the means to burn good incense regularly was a marker of wealth and status. A wealthy monastery could burn expensive frankincense constantly. A poor parish church might burn cheaper substances or use less, and because incense was expensive, it was saved for important occasions. High religious holidays, feast days, major liturgical moments. Those were the times when the best incense would be burned, and those were the times when monks and priests would be most thoroughly exposed to whatever psychoactive effects the incense had. The effect of inhaling incense smoke is cumulative and subtle. You don't notice it happening in the moment. You're not suddenly struck by obvious intoxication, but over the course of a long service with continuous exposure to aromatic smoke, with other factors creating a heightened spiritual and psychological state, you definitely feel something. The smoke gets into your lungs. The compounds get into your bloodstream. Your consciousness is slightly altered. Your emotional state is affected. You feel more peaceful, more open, more capable of having spiritual experiences. And this is exactly the state you'd want to be in if you were trying to have a profound religious experience. If you wanted to feel the presence of God. If you wanted to feel the presence of God. If you wanted to have a vision or a mystical experience. If you wanted to open yourself spiritually. The slightly altered consciousness produced by incense smoke would facilitate that, would make you more suggestible, would make you more likely to interpret ambiguous sensations or thoughts as divine communication. One of the genuinely interesting questions is whether medieval religious experiences were enhanced by incense use Whether the visions reported by monks and nuns and saints might have been partly mediated by the constant use of aromatic incense, whether the profound sense of divine presence felt during church services might have been partly chemically induced. And there's no way to know for certain, but the possibility is real. What's also real is that medieval people had access to a range of aromatic substances beyond just frankincense and myrrh. They had access to various resins, to spices like clove and nutmeg that have their own aromatic and slightly psychoactive compounds, to herbs that could be burned, and some of these were mixed into incense deliberately. Some were probably discovered accidentally. An incense maker would add something for the smell and discover that it changed the effect. Some were probably deliberately formulated by people who understood that they wanted to enhance the psychoactive properties. The combination of I and science with other drugs is also worth considering. If a monk was taking a small amount of laudanum and then sitting in a room full of frankincense smoke while chanting psalms, the combined effects would be significant. The opium would reduce pain and anxiety. The incense would be providing additional psychoactive compounds. The expectation of spiritual experience would be shaping perception. The result would be a profound alteration of consciousness that would definitely feel spiritual or divine. And this is the thing that's remarkable about medieval drug culture when you really examine it. It's not compartmentalized. It's not separate from religious life. It's integrated into every aspect of existence. You're getting drugs from incense in church. You're getting drugs from wine with meals. You're getting drugs from medicines prescribed for ailments. You're getting drugs from recreational use of cannabis or small beer. And all of these are combining, creating a background of constant, multi-source chemical alteration. You're now drifting into some of the deepest and strangest parts of medieval pharmacology. You're in the study of a medieval physician, and on his shelf is a jar containing something legendary. Inside is a thick, dark, expensive substance that is called, by many names, theriac. Triacle, the possibly most complicated medicine ever created by human beings. A concoction that might contain anywhere from 30 to 100 different ingredients mixed according to elaborate recipes passed down through generations. What you're looking at is medieval pharmaceutical ambition taken to its absolute extreme. Theriac isn't one thing. Different regions made it differently. Different physicians created their own versions, but the basic idea was always the same. Combine everything that works to create the ultimate medicine that cures everything. Or at least everything serious. You've put in opium, obviously. You'd put in various herbs with known medicinal properties. You'd put in spices imported from Asia. You'd put in minerals. And here's where it gets weird. You'd put in venom, specifically viper venom. The idea was that to create an antidote to poison, you needed to include the poison itself in small amounts. Theriac is the medieval equivalent of snake oil, except it was actually official medicine. It was prescribed by physicians. It was made in pharmacies. It was sold at high prices, and it was genuinely believed to work, which, given that it included opium, meant it probably did do something. You take theriac and you feel better because you'd been given opium and because your expectation that you'd feel better was high. But theriac is also genuinely interesting as a pharmaceutical achievement. Creating theriac was complex. You had to source ingredients from all over the known world. You had to follow elaborate recipes that specified exact proportions and preparation methods. You had to age the final product, sometimes for years, believing that it would improve with time, develop its full potency. And here's the really interesting thing. By following these elaborate recipes correctly, medieval apothecaries were actually performing chemistry. They were extracting compounds from plants. They were preserving them in various media. They were creating stable combinations of different substances. They were doing practical pharmaceutical work. The ingredients in different versions of theriac vary, but common ones included opium, lots of it saffron, myrrh, cinnamon, castoreum, frankincense, rose petals, ginger, nutmeg, various herbs, minerals including gold and silver, though in doses so small they'd have no pharmacological effect, viper venom, and many other things. Some versions included parts of animals, bits of scorpion for instance, some including ingredients that had no obvious medicinal value, but were included because the recipe said so, because tradition said so, because maybe they helped and nobody wanted to stop including them. The thing about theriac is that it was legitimately documented. We have detailed recipes for theriac from medieval and ancient sources. We know how it was made, and one of the remarkable things is that the recipes are internally coherent. They specify proportions that make sense in the context of the theory of the four humors. They include ingredients whose properties, according to medieval understanding, would balance each other. It's medieval pharmaceutical science in its most elaborate form. But what did theriac actually do? Well, if it contained as much opium as some sources suggest, then it definitely did something. It would produce pain relief, mild euphoria, sedation depending on the dose. The other ingredients might have had minor effects. Some have genuine pharmacological properties. Some were probably inert, but the combination with opium as the active ingredient would have genuine effects, and people absolutely swore by it. There are accounts of physicians prescribing theriac for almost any condition. A wound that wouldn't heal, the plague, depression, fever, the list goes on. The remarkable thing is that if it was mostly opium, then, yeah, it would help with a lot of those things. Pain would be reduced. Fever-induced anxiety would be reduced. The person would feel more peaceful and less distressed. They might feel better enough that their body could actually heal more effectively. Opium isn't a cure, but it's not nothing. There's also the factor of expectation. If you believe that theriac was a genuine medicine, a real cure, a substance that had been used successfully for centuries, and if you had access to it, which meant you had money and status, then taking it would create an expectation of improvement. You'd take the theriac and you'd feel better, at least partly because you expected to feel better, and that's not nothing. The placebo effect is real and powerful. Theriac also shows up in some really interesting ways in medieval culture. It becomes almost legendary. You get stories about theriac being effective against impossible things. You get claims that theriac can save you from any poison, that it's a cure-all, that it's the ultimate medicine. And these claims are being made about a substance that might be 10 to 30% opium, mixed with herbs and other substances. But because it contains opium, because opium genuinely does reduce pain and produce euphoria, because the ingredient list sounds impressive, and is in fact genuinely complicated, people believed the claims. Theriac was also extremely expensive. It required ingredients from all over the world. It required time to prepare and age. It required the skill of an experienced apothecary. So theriac was a luxury medicine available to the wealthy. This meant that theriac had the additional status marker of being expensive and hard to obtain. You could only take theriac if you had money. This made it even more valuable. If the rich were using theriac, then it must be real medicine. Some of the most famous recipes for theriac come down to us from Islamic physicians who had been making it for centuries. The Muslim medical tradition preserved and refined theriac recipes. And when these recipes came to Europe through trade and translation, they became integrated into European medicine. Medieval European physicians would create their own versions of theriac, following the general principles, but adapting them to available ingredients and local traditions. There's also a weird side business that grew around theriac. Because theriac was expensive and in demand, there were people in fake theriac, creating cheap imitations that looked like theriac but lacked the genuine ingredients, or lacked them in the right proportions. This black market theriac was probably less effective because it had less opium, but people couldn't necessarily tell the difference. This created a situation where the fake theriac was actively worse than nothing, because people might delay treating a serious condition while waiting for the theriac to work. One of the quirky details about theriac is that the more elaborate and expensive versions actually contained gold and silver. These metals would be ground into powder and mixed into the preparation. From a modern perspective, this has no medicinal value. The metals would pass through your digestive system, essentially unchanged. But from a medieval perspective, gold and silver were precious. They were associated with value and power, and including them in a medicine made sense. It made the medicine more powerful through sympathetic magic. The value of the gold transferred to the medicine. It also made the medicine more expensive, which meant it was accessible only to the truly wealthy, which made them happy because it meant their medicine was special. Theriac represents peak medieval pharmaceutical confidence. The belief that you could combine enough ingredients, create the right recipe, use the right ingredients, and achieve something genuinely powerful, something that would heal. The reality was probably less impressive than the mythology, but the fact that medieval physicians were willing to create such complicated formulations, to spend the effort to source rare ingredients, to follow elaborate recipes, that shows you something important about medieval medicine. It was willing to be ambitious. It was willing to experiment. It was willing to create complicated solutions to complicated problems. You're standing now at a crossroads in medieval history. It's the time of the Crusades. Christian European armies are moving east toward the Holy Land, ostensibly on religious pilgrimage, actually for conquest and plunder. They're bringing swords and ambition, and they're coming back with something perhaps more valuable than all their military victories. Knowledge. Knowledge about medicine, knowledge about pharmacy, knowledge about how the Islamic world understood and used psychoactive substances. The Crusades lasted roughly 2 centuries, from the late 1000s to the late 1200s, with various campaigns continuing after that. And for the entire duration of those wars and the occupation that followed, medieval Christian Europeans were in direct contact with Islamic civilization, which was in many ways vastly more advanced in terms of medical and pharmaceutical knowledge. Islamic physicians had preserved and built upon ancient Greek and Roman medicine. They had added their own innovations. They had created sophisticated pharmaceutical systems, and now suddenly European crusaders and merchants were being exposed to this knowledge. The result was a pharmaceutical knowledge transfer that fundamentally changed medieval European medicine. European physicians began learning Arabic. Medical texts were translated from Arabic to Latin. Ideas that had been current in the Islamic world for centuries suddenly became available to Europeans. And among those ideas were ideas about using psychoactive substances as medicine. One of the most famous examples of this knowledge transfer is the case of opium. Opium had been known in Europe before the Crusades, but the Islamic understanding of opium, how to prepare it, how to dose it, what conditions it could treat, was more sophisticated. Crusaders and merchants came back with this knowledge. They came back with laudanum recipes that had been refined through centuries of Islamic medical practice. They came back with the understanding that opium could be combined with other substances to create powerful medicines. But it wasn't just opium. It was a whole range of substances and techniques. It was the understanding of how to extract active compounds from plants using various solvents. It was the understanding of how to preserve those compounds. It was the understanding of dosing and combination therapy. Medieval European medicine, after the Crusades, incorporated this accumulated Islamic knowledge, and the result was that European physicians had access to more powerful, more effective medicines. The trade networks that followed the Crusades also meant that ingredients could move more easily from the Islamic world to Europe. Spices that we used medically, resins like frankincense and myrrh, herbs, processed drugs like hashish. All of these could be obtained through merchants who worked the Crusade routes. And as demand increased, supply increased. More traders began specializing in bringing pharmaceutical ingredients from the Middle East to Europe. It's important to understand that this wasn't seen as contamination or corruption. It wasn't seen as Europe adopting dangerous foreign ideas. It was seen as progress. European physicians had access to better medicine because they now understood Islamic pharmaceutical techniques and the drugs that came along with that knowledge, the opiates, the cannabis, the various other psychoactive and medicinal substances, were integrated into European medical practice, not as foreign or dangerous, but as genuinely valuable. The apothecaries who rose to prominence in medieval European cities during this period, the ones who became wealthy and influential, were often the ones who had the best access to Islamic pharmaceutical knowledge and Islamic ingredients. They had connections with merchants. They had translated texts. They had learned the recipes, and they could produce effective medicines that worked better than what had been available before. One of the things that happened as a result of this knowledge transfer is that the line between European and Islamic medicine started to blur. By the 1200s and 1300s, There was a shared pharmaceutical knowledge base among educated physicians across the Mediterranean world. A physician in Venice might use the same medicines as a physician in Alexandria or Baghdad. The same recipes would be known. The same substances would be valued, and the same psychoactive substances would be integrated into the medical arsenal. This also meant that the experience of being medicated was increasingly standardized. Whether you were in medieval Spain or medieval Italy or medieval England, if you went to a physician and got treatment, you'd probably receive some combination of substances that was recognizable across the Mediterranean world. You'd get opium, probably. You might get cannabis. You might get herbs that had been standardized in Islamic pharmacology. And you'd experience pretty much the same chemical effects that someone in the Islamic world would experience. The Crusades also brought back knowledge about other substances. There's evidence that some Europeans learned about various other plant-based medicines, while in the Middle East or from contact with Islamic merchants. Plants that weren't traditionally used in Europe became known, and some of these were psychoactive substances. Cannabis, as we've discussed, became integrated into European medicine, partly through contact with Islamic practice. Other substances, some of which were less mainstream, also entered the European knowledge base. Here's a quirky detail that historians still argue about. Some evidence suggests that the Assassins, a Shiite Islamic military order that existed from the 1000s to the 1200s, used hashish as part of their initiation and training. The word assassin might even come from hashishin, the hashish users. Whether this is true or whether it's a legend created by European observers who didn't understand Islamic culture remains unclear. But the legend itself shows that Crusaders were aware that Islamic societies used hashish and understood it as something significant. And when they came back to Europe, they brought that awareness with them. The knowledge transfer wasn't entirely one way. Europeans also brought things to the Islamic world. But in terms of pharmaceuticals and medicine, the flow of knowledge was predominantly from the sophisticated Islamic medical tradition to the less developed European one. And that flow of knowledge fundamentally changed what was available to medieval Europeans. By the time the Crusades ended in the late 1200s, European medicine had been transformed. The pharmaceutical arsenal available to physicians was vastly larger and more sophisticated than it had been 2 centuries earlier, and a significant portion of that new arsenal consisted of psychoactive substances learned about through contact with Islamic medicine. Opium, cannabis, various other drugs, all of these were now part of the standard medical practice of educated European physicians. And this is important because it establishes that medieval European drug use didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a sophisticated medical tradition that had developed over centuries in the Islamic world. It came from knowledge and practice that were proven to work. It came with recipes and dosing guidelines. It came with physicians who understood how to use these substances safely, or at least safely, compared to random experimentation. The drug culture of medieval Europe was building on a foundation of genuine pharmaceutical knowledge. You're in a medieval marketplace and the air is loud with merchants hawking their wares, bolts of fabric, pots and pans, meats from butchers, vegetables from farmers. And among all of this, in a shop with more architectural presence than most, something impressive, something well built, something that speaks to money and permanence, is the apothecary. And this person, the apothecary, is one of the most important and most interesting figures in medieval society. The apothecary is not quite a doctor, not quite a pharmacist in the modern sense, something different from both. The apothecary is a chemist, a merchant, an expert in plants and drugs, a seller of medicines, sometimes an advisor on medical issues, and they occupy a strange social position. They're definitely not nobles, but they're often wealthy. They have specialized knowledge. They have power in a sense, because they're the ones who have access to the substances that everyone needs. And they're deeply embedded in the gossip and social networks of their communities, because they're where people come when they're in trouble, when they're sick, when they're in pain, when they're desperate. An apothecary's shop would have been a remarkable place. On the shelves would be jars and bottles containing dried herbs, powdered minerals, oils, tinctures, preparations. Some of these were clearly medicinal, recognizable herbs like sage or rosemary. Some were more mysterious, rare materials, imported from distant places, substances that cost significant money, that were valuable enough to be kept under lock and key. The apothecary would have had knowledge of what was in each container, how to prepare medicines from the contents, how to dose them, and this knowledge was power. Apothecaries also occupied an interesting legal position. In some cases, they were strictly regulated. Certain medicines required certain certifications. Certain preparations we remonitored. In other cases, they operated in a legal gray area. They could sell substances that technically maybe should have been restricted, or they operated in jurisdictions where the regulatory framework was loose. This meant that apothecaries became a source not just for legitimate medicinal substances, but also for substances that were being used outside of strictly medicinal contexts. One of the things that's fascinating about apothecaries is that they were positioned between expertise and commercialism. They had real pharmaceutical knowledge. They understood which plants had which properties. They understood preparation methods. They understood that dosing mattered, but they were also trying to make a living. And that meant they had to satisfy their customers. If someone came in and wanted opium, they'd sell opium. If someone wanted a tincture that would help them sleep, they'd create one. If someone wanted something with a reputation for helping with masculine performance, which would require drugs with stimulant or blood pressure altering properties, they'd create something. The apothecary shop was also a social hub. It was where gossip happened. It was where women came to get medicines for contraception or to induce abortion. It was where men came to get medicines for sexual dysfunction. It was where people came with their pain and their anxiety and their desperation. The apothecary would hear all of this, would understand the community's medical needs, and would position themselves as the person who could provide solutions. There's also evidence that apothecaries sometimes had reputations for being able to obtain substances that were hard to find. A particularly skilled or well-connected apothecary might have sources of rare opium or genuine hashish imported from the Middle East or other valuable substances. These apothecaries would develop clientele, Aman, Jeeved, the wealthy and connected. They'd build reputations. They'd become prestigious. The apothecary was also in many cases a chemist researcher. They'd experiment with preparations. They'd try to improve medicines. They'd work with new materials when they came available. If new plants arrived from trade, the apothecary would try them, would experiment with them, would figure out how to use them. This was genuine pharmaceutical research done by trial and error. One of the things we don't have a lot of documentation about is the recreational use of substances sold by apothecaries. But there's enough evidence to suggest it happened. An apothecary might discreetly sell cannabis to someone who wanted to experience its intoxicating effects rather than use it medically. They might provide opium to someone who was more interested in the euphoria than the pain relief. They might have special customers who came in regularly with no particular medical complaint, just looking for something to alter their consciousness, and the apothecary being a practical person. Would probably accommodate this because it was profitable, because it wasn't illegal, because the line between medical and recreational use was blurry enough that they could maintain the fiction that everything was medicinal if questioned. Apothecaries also became wealthy enough to have significant social status. In some medieval cities, apothecaries were represented in city government. They had guilds that set standards and controlled membership. They could train apprentices. They had shops that were valuable properties in premium locations. The successful apothecary was relatively comfortable, relatively respected. This was not poverty. This was actually a pretty good position to occupy in medieval society. There's a weird way in which apothecaries were somewhat parasitic on human suffering. They profited from pain, from anxiety, from fear, but they also provided genuine services. They created medicines that worked. They provided alternatives to dangerous surgery or bloodletting. They were in some ways the most competent healthcare providers of the medieval period, ahead of physicians in terms of practical knowledge, ahead of surgeons in terms of safety. The apothecary's knowledge base came from multiple sources. It came from medieval, European, herbalism traditions. It came from Islamic medicine either directly or through translated texts. It came from personal experience. and experimentation. It came from customer feedback. If a medicine seemed to work, the apothecary would note that and continue using it. If it didn't work, they'd try something else. This was a kind of evidence-based medicine, though not in any formal sense. Apothecaries also benefited from the fact that medicine was partly placebo. If you told a customer that something would help, and you gave them something, there was a good chance they'd feel better. Partly because the medicine might actually work, partly because they believed it would work, partly because just receiving care and attention makes people feel better. The apothecary understood this, even if they didn't have language for it. The apothecary shop was also where you could get cosmetics and beauty preparations, many of which were intensely toxic. These included things with mercury, with arsenic, with lead, substances that would cause chronic poisoning with long-term use. But they worked in the sense that they did produce certain effects. Mercury-based preparations could lighten skin. Lead-based preparations could whiten skin. The costs of these preparations, chronic poisoning, eventual death from repeated exposure, were accepted as the price of beauty, and the apothecary was the one who provided them. So the apothecary was a complex figure, part merchant, part chemist, part healthcare provider, part pusher of dangerous substances, part snake oil salesman, part genuine expert. All of these things at once. You're now thinking about a group of people who have historically been invisible in narratives about medieval medicine and drug use. Women, specifically women healers, midwives, wise women, herbalists, cunning folk, people, usually women, though not exclusively, who had knowledge of plants and how to use them. And in many ways, these women knew more about practical pharmacology than the officially educated physicians. Because here's the thing. While male physicians were studying medical texts and debating humoral theory, women healers were dealing with actual problems. They were helping women give birth. They were treating women's health issues that male physicians often refused to treat or didn't understand. They were creating medicines that worked, and they had access to an understanding of psychoactive substances that often exceeded that of the official medical establishment. Medieval women healers used opium. They used it to help with labor pain during childbirth. They used it to help women sleep during late pregnancy, when sleep was difficult. They used it to treat various conditions. A midwife would have in her collection of medicines something that would reduce pain. Laudanum, probably, or some preparation of poppy, and this was recognized as legitimate medical practice. When a woman was in the agonies of childbirth, nobody questioned whether opium should be used. Of course it should. The question was how much, how to prepare it, how to time it, so that the baby wouldn't be born too sedated, but the mother would be helped. Women healers also used other psychoactive substances. Cannabis was valuable in midwifery because it could help with pain and anxiety and also had some properties that were believed to facilitate labor. Herbs like angelica and pennyroyal had reputations for affecting female reproductive function. Some of these had real pharmacological effects. Some were probably folklore, but the women healers knew which ones had traditions of use and they incorporated them into their practice. What's remarkable is how competent medieval women healers were. They understood anatomy better than most physicians because they actually dealt with bodies constantly. They understood that dosing mattered. They understood that individual women responded differently to the same medicine. They understood that you had to observe effects and adjust accordingly. This was practical pharmacology. Women healers were particularly crucial for illicit pharmaceutical needs. If a woman needed something to terminate a pregnancy, she would go to a woman healer, not to a male physician. She might get herbs like pennyroyal or ergot, substances that had some genuine pharmacological effects that could potentially induce abortion. She might get herbal preparations that combined multiple substances. The success rate was probably low, and the danger was significant. Some of the substances that could induce abortion were genuinely toxic, but if a woman was desperate enough, she'd take the risk. There's also evidence that some women healers were deliberately formulating substances to create specific effects. If you wanted to increase fertility, there were preparations. If you wanted to increase libido, there were preparations which would have contained substances like alcohol, cannabis, and possibly other stimulants. If you wanted to make someone more amenable to your advances, there were herbs. Some probably had genuine pharmacological effects. Some were pure magic. Some were probably more sinister, potentially containing substances that would cloud judgment or make someone suggestible. Historians still argue about how much actual knowledge medieval women healers had versus how much was folklore or magical thinking. But the evidence suggests they had significant practical knowledge. They knew which plants had which effects. They knew about drug combinations. They knew about dosing. And they used this knowledge to help people, to relieve suffering, to manage reproduction. One of the things that makes medieval women healers remarkable is that they were often working in contexts of significant legal danger. If someone died after taking medicine from a woman healer, she could be accused of witchcraft.
If she was too successful, if she helped women get abortions, or women with infertility problems, or women with gynecological issues, she could attract suspicion and accusations.
Many of the women executed as witches in the early modern period were likely women healers whose pharmaceutical knowledge was interpreted through a supernatural lens. The persecution of women healers is partly the story of the medicalization of women's health. As male physicians gained more authority and wanted to control more aspects of medicine, they pushed out the women healers who had traditionally served women's needs. And they did this partly through branding them as witches, as practitioners of supernatural rather than natural medicine. Women healers also had knowledge of contraception. They knew which herbs supposedly helped prevent pregnancy. Some of these would have had genuine effects. Some would interfere with hormonal cycles or have anti-fertility properties. Some were probably folklore. But the point is that women had access to pharmacological knowledge that allowed them to have some control over their reproduction. And that knowledge was transmitted by woman to woman, healer to healer, often in secretive ways. The relationship between women healers and institutional medicine is also interstitiation. Some female healers were tolerated, even licensed by city governments. They filled a necessary role. They provided health care that male physicians wouldn't or couldn't, but they were always working within constraints. They had to be careful not to seem too powerful, too successful, too knowledgeable. They had to frame their work as service to the community, as charity, not as professional expertise. They had to avoid making male physicians look bad. What's clear is that medieval women healers were sophisticated pharmaceutical practitioners. They had knowledge about plants and drugs that were sophisticated and practical. They had access to psychoactive substances and used them carefully and skillfully. They helped people, often relieved suffering that nobody else could relieve. And their contributions to medieval medicine have been largely erased or reframed as witchcraft. One particularly interesting angle is that women healers might have had more sophisticated understanding of dosing and individual variation than male physicians, because they were treating actual people with actual problems. They had to pay attention to how different people responded to medicines. They developed intuitive understanding of pharmacology that was probably more practical than the theoretical knowledge of physicians who hadn't actually given medicines to large numbers of real patients. The herbal preparations that women healers created would have included opium, obviously, but also various other substances with psychoactive or consciousness-altering properties. They'd create preparations that combined multiple substances: alcohol with herbs, opium with other pain relievers, cannabis with other calming plants. These combination preparations might have worked better than single substances because of additive effects, or because some ingredients enhanced others. And the knowledge that women healers had was often connected to sexuality and reproduction, two areas where consciousness-altering substances are particularly relevant. Pain relief during sex, increasing arousal, dealing with the emotional aspects of reproductive health. These were things women healers understood and treated. The erasure of women healers from the history of medicine is one of the major blind spots in how we understand the medieval period. If you only look at official medicine, physicians' texts, university-trained doctors, you're missing the people who were actually providing most of the healthcare and most of the drug-based treatment. That was women healers. You're now in the chambers of a medieval noble woman, and the light is coming through narrow windows, casting shadows across the walls. This woman's face is startling to look at. Her skin is white, almost corpse-like in its pallor. Her lips are extremely dark, almost black. Her eyebrows are completely removed. Actually, let's be clear about that. She literally removed them deliberately. She's undergone a cosmetic transformation that modern people would find shocking and uncomfortable. And this transformation came at a significant cost to her health. It came through the regular use of substances that were actively poisoning her. Medieval and particularly Renaissance beauty standards for women were defined by extreme pallor and a kind of ethereal, almost ghostly appearance. It was supposed to look noble, refined, otherworldly. It was supposed to signal that you didn't do manual labor, that you were wealthy enough to stay indoors, and to achieve this look, women used cosmetics based on truly toxic substances. The foundational product was white lead, also called ceruse or flake white. You'd mix it into preparations and apply it to your face and body to achieve that deathly pallor. The problem is that lead is a neurotoxin. Chronic exposure causes brain damage, kidney damage, reproductive damage, a wide range of terrible effects. But it worked. It made you white. So women applied it repeatedly every day. To darken the lips and eyebrows, women used other toxic substances. Mercury-based preparations were common. Kohl, a preparation with lead compounds, was used around the eyes. These substances would be applied directly to mucous membranes, to skin, to areas where absorption would be rapid and efficient. The women who used them would accumulate toxins in their bodies. Over time, they'd experience poisoning symptoms. Some sources describe women with thin, fragile skin, prone to infections, with hair loss, with tooth problems, all symptoms of chronic lead or mercury poisoning. And here's the truly dark part. Some women knew this was happening. Some medieval medical texts describe the side effects of these cosmetics. They note that white lead causes problems. They suggest that women should use it less frequently or in less concentrated forms. But the cosmetics continued to be used anyway, because beauty, as defined by the culture, was worth the poisoning. It was worth sacrificing your health. This is where we encounter consciousness-altering substances in the context of beauty and status. The poisons themselves weren't psychoactive in the way that opium or cannabis were. They didn't produce altered consciousness, but the chronic exposure to them, the lead and mercury accumulating in the brain and nervous system, would have produced low-grade neurological effects, mood changes, changes in cognitive function, subtle alterations in how the brain worked. So medieval noble women were essentially engaging in self-poisoning in pursuit of beauty, and this self-poisoning was altering their consciousness, subtly but continuously. They were living with a background of low-level neurological damage that was imperceptible on a day-to-day basis, but that accumulated over time. Beyond the white lead, there were other toxins involved in medieval cosmetics. Arsenic was sometimes used. Preparations containing mercury compounds were common. Some women used preparations involving opium or other drugs, supposedly for specific skin conditions or to achieve certain effects. So medieval elite women were essentially engaging in complex pharmaceutical self-administration, poisoning themselves deliberately in order to achieve culturally mandated beauty standards. What's also worth noting is that this happened with the full knowledge and endorsement of the male-dominated medical establishment. Male physicians wrote about these cosmetics. They described what women were doing. Some objected, cautioning against the use of toxins, but many seemed to have accepted it as simply what women did to maintain their appearance. And some physicians actively sold cosmetics themselves or derived profit from them. The availability of these toxic cosmetics created a whole secondary pharmaceutical market. Apothecaries would sell cosmetic preparations. Merchants would trade in cosmetic ingredients. You could buy white lead, mercury compounds, and other substances from merchants and apothecaries who understood perfectly well what they were for. And this was completely legal and socially accepted. One of the things that makes this particularly interesting in the context of medieval drug use is that it shows how normalized self-poisoning was. Medieval people weren't afraid of toxins the way modern people sometimes are. They understood that substances had effects, that some of those effects were negative, but they were willing to accept the negative effects in exchange for the positive ones. Women were willing to poison themselves for beauty. Physicians were willing to treat patients with substances that were genuinely toxic. People in general were willing to use medicines that might kill them. There's also evidence that some of the psychoactive effects of these cosmetics might have been sought after. If you're applying mercury-based preparations to your face daily, if you're ingesting trace amounts of lead through cosmetics, your neurological function is being altered. If those alterations produce certain psychological effects, euphoria, confidence, a kind of disconnection from reality, well, those might be positive from a subjective perspective. You'd feel better while you were being poisoned. The cosmetic use of toxins is also tied up with gender and power. Women were required by social convention, by male authority, by economic necessity. Beauty was valuable. Attractive women had more options, so they poisoned themselves in order to meet beauty standards. Men were not subject to the same requirements. Men didn't apply lead to their faces. Men weren't poisoning themselves to achieve the appearance of nobility and wealth. This is a gendered form of pharmaceutical coercion, even if it wasn't explicitly framed that way. It's also worth noting that the specific cosmetic preparations popular in different periods changed. In some periods, pale skin was valued, and women used white lead. In other periods, slightly less extreme pallor might be valued, and women would use less concentrated preparations or apply less frequently. These changes in cosmetic practice meant that the chronic poisoning was more or less severe, depending on the fashion. Medieval women were essentially being told to poison themselves to different degrees depending on what the cultural beauty standard happened to be at any given moment. The resources required to poison yourself in these fashionable ways also meant that these cosmetics were markers of class. Only wealthy women could afford high-quality white lead, could afford the mercury compounds, could afford the frequent applications. Poor women couldn't afford it, or couldn't afford it, high-quality versions. This meant that the pallid, damaged look became a status symbol. It signaled that you were wealthy enough to destroy your health for the sake of appearance. Historians still argue about how aware medieval women were of the dangers of these cosmetics. Some evidence suggests many women understood the risks. Some evidence suggests they didn't fully grasp the long-term consequences. Some evidence suggests they understood but made a conscious choice, accepting the poisoning as the price of meeting beauty standards and accessing the opportunities that beauty provided. You're now in a monastery in the middle of the night, and it's a moment of private study. A monk has a small candle lit in his cell. He has a manuscript in front of him, probably. Religious text, maybe scripture, maybe theological treatise. And he's absolutely awake and alert, focused on his reading, his understanding, his thinking. And this alertness is chemically enabled. He's been given something to help him stay awake, probably wine, possibly something with a stimulant effect, possibly something more creative. Monastic life involved practices that modern people would find extremely odd. The monks were supposed to pray, read, work, and maintain a complex schedule of religious services throughout the day and night. Some of that schedule involved getting up in the middle of the night to pray. This is called the offices or the divine office, scheduled prayer times, sometimes every few hours. The midnight office was particularly important. Monks would be roused from sleep to go pray, and then they'd go back to sleep, presumably. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd stay partially awake waiting for the next service. This schedule is frankly brutal. You can't sleep continuously if you're being woken every few hours. You're constantly partially sleep-deprived, and in this context, substances that help you stay awake or that give you energy become valuable. There's evidence that some monastic orders used alcohol specifically for this purpose. The wine that monks drank with meals, and that was available to them at various points during the day. It wasn't just for pleasure or just for nutrition. Some of it was strategic.
Wine would help you stay awake during night prayers. Wine would give you the energy to continue with work and prayer even though you're sleep-deprived.
Wine could help you focus and concentrate. Some monastic orders also engaged in a practice that was explicitly about enhancing consciousness during spiritual work. They would consume wine, sometimes in quantity, during periods of intense spiritual practice. A monk might drink wine before engaging in deep study or intense prayer, understanding that the mild intoxication would alter his consciousness in ways that might facilitate spiritual experience or deep thinking. There's also evidence that some medieval monks experimented with other substances to enhance their spiritual practice. Some of the incense used during prayers might have been modified to have stronger psychoactive properties. Some monks might have deliberately consumed small amounts of other psychoactive substances, mandrake or henbane, before engaging in spiritual practice, believing that the altered consciousness would facilitate spiritual experience. Here's where the scholarly debate comes in. Historians still argue whether medieval monastic spirituality was enhanced by drug use, whether some of the famous mystical experiences reported by monks were partially mediated by psychoactive substances they'd consumed, whether the intellectual and spiritual achievements of monastic culture were partly enabled by regular use of consciousness-altering substances. The evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. Medieval monastery libraries contain evidence of sophisticated intellectual work. Monks made important contributions to theology, to philosophy, to the development of knowledge, and some of this work happened under conditions where the monks were mildly to moderately intoxicated. Does that mean the intoxication enhanced the work, or did it just make it possible for the monks to continue working despite sleep deprivation and harsh conditions? There's also the question of whether regular consumption of wine and other substances created a kind of baseline altered consciousness that medieval monks just accepted as normal. If you drank wine regularly, if you were regularly mildly intoxicated, would your baseline consciousness be slightly altered? Would your thinking be subtly different from that of someone in full sobriety? And if so, how would that have affected the intellectual and spiritual work that medieval monks did? One of the things that's fascinating is that some monastic rules explicitly address the question of substance consumption. The rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational rule for Western monasticism, specifically discusses wine consumption. It allows wine, recognizes that some monks might drink more than others, tries to set guidelines about appropriate consumption. The fact that the rule addresses this suggests that wine consumption and its effects were recognized as important enough to warrant explicit guidance. Some monastic rules also addressed other substances. Some mention of herbal preparations, recognition that monks might use medicines, some implicit acknowledgement that consciousness-altering substances were part of monastic life and needed to be managed. What's clear is that medieval monks were not living in states of pure sobriety. They were consuming alcohol regularly. They were probably being exposed to psychoactive compounds from incense. In some cases, they were probably deliberately using other substances. And this was all happening within the context of intense spiritual practice. The intellectual output of medieval monasteries, the preservation of texts, the creation of new theology, the development of knowledge happened in this context. Medieval monks produced remarkable work while being regularly intoxicated. Whether the intoxication helped or hindered or was neutral is impossible to determine, but it happened. There's also something kind of romantic about the idea of medieval monks drinking wine and studying theology by candlelight, their consciousness altered by alcohol and incense, trying to understand divine truth. It fits with a certain aesthetic, and maybe that aesthetic is partly why we think of medieval monasteries as particularly spiritual or enlightened places, because we're drawn to the image of monks getting high on wine while thinking deep thoughts. What's important to understand is that this wasn't shocking or sinful from the medieval perspective. It was normal. Monks drank. Monks were occasionally intoxicated. It was normal. Monks drank. Monks were occasionally intoxicated. This was part of their lives, and it was accepted as compatible with their spiritual vocation. They weren't thought of as failing morally because they drank. They were thought of as carrying out the functions of their order, which included consuming wine and engaging in prayer and study. You're thinking now about something that medieval people understood intuitively, and that modern pharmacology confirms. You can absorb drugs through your skin. Medieval healers knew this. They created preparations, salves, oils, balms that were rubbed onto skin and that delivered active pharmacological compounds directly into the body. This is called transdermal absorption. And medieval people didn't have a name for it, but they definitely knew it happened. but they definitely knew it happened. One of the most famous examples is belladonna salve. A practitioner would create a salve or ointment containing belladonna or other tropane alkaloid plants. They'd rub it on skin, usually on places where you wanted maximal absorption, like the inner wrist or the thin skin around the eyes, or sometimes on the genitals. The alkaloids would be absorbed through the skin into the bloodstream, and within an hour or so, the person would start experiencing the effects: hallucinations, dissociation, the sensation of flying or floating.
What's remarkable is that medieval people understood that this worked and used it deliberately. They created these preparations understanding that they would be psychoactive.
They applied them understanding what the results would be. This is sophisticated pharmacology, understanding that the route of administrate ion matters, that you can achieve drug absorption through means other than oral consumption. Medieval women healers also created salves for other purposes, using transdermal delivery. Some would contain opium, a pain-killing salve that could be applied directly to areas of pain. Some would contain cannabis or other psychoactive substances for various purposes. The principle was the same: create a preparation in a form that would absorb through skin, apply it, and achieve systemic effects. The beauty is that transdermal delivery is often less efficient than oral delivery, and slower, which meant that some of the dangers could be reduced. If you were absorbing belladonna through your skin, you were absorbing it more slowly than if you'd eaten it directly. The effect would build more gradually. You'd have more warning if you were overdosing, and from the medieval perspective, this was better. There's also evidence that medieval people used transdermal delivery for medicinal purposes that seem almost modern in their sophistication. Create a salve containing a specific substance. Apply it to the area where you want the effect and let the substance absorb through the skin directly into that area's tissues and bloodstream. This is not dramatically different from how some modern transdermal patches work. The issue is that medieval people didn't always understand exactly what was being absorbed or in what quantities. Creating a salve with consistent concentration of active ingredient is genuinely difficult without modern methods. You might create two salves using the same recipe and end up with very different concentrations of the active substance. Medieval healers had to manage this through experience and observation. One of the things that medieval people discovered is that certain substances absorb through skin better than others. Cannabis oil-based preparations would absorb well. Opium dissolved in oils or fats would absorb. The tropane alkaloid plants, belladonna, henbane, would absorb remarkably well, which is part of why salves containing them were so effective and why they were so dangerous. The effects could be stronger and less predictable than people expected. There's also evidence that medieval people used transdermal delivery deliberately for substances that might be dangerous or unpleasant if taken orally. If you didn't want to drink something because it tasted horrible, or because you wanted to avoid the gastrointestinal effects, you could create a salve and absorb it through skin instead. This was particularly useful for substances that were beneficial, but unpleasant to consume directly. Some of the most sophisticated medieval pharmaceutical preparations involve combining transdermal delivery with other routes. You might take a small amount of a substance orally to get some effects and simultaneously apply a salve to get additional effects through transdermal absorption. You'd layer different routes of administration to create a specific overall effect. Historians still argue about exactly how sophisticated medieval understanding of transdermal delivery was. Did medieval people understand the principles, or were they applying substances to skin based on tradition and observation without really understanding why it worked? The evidence suggests they understood enough to use it effectively and to deliberately choose it as a route of administration when it seemed advantageous. What's also interesting is how gendered some of the transdermal preparations were. There's evidence that women healers created specific preparations for women's health issues that would be applied transdermally. Men healers or physicians might create different preparations. The gendered knowledge systems seem to have created different pharmaceutical traditio. Ends. The use of transdermal delivery also allowed medieval people to achieve drug effects without some of the risks of oral consumption. You couldn't overdose as easily if you were absorbing through skin. The saturation point is different. You couldn't aspirate, Get the substance into your lungs instead of your stomach. You had more control over the speed of absorption. One of the chemical sophistications the transdermal delivery required is understanding which substances would actually cross the skin barrier and which wouldn't. The belladonna alkaloids do cross readily. So do some of the other psychoactive compounds, but not all substances do. Medieval people had to figure out through trial and error which substances could be delivered this way and which couldn't. The combination of understanding transdermal delivery with understanding how to make effective salves and preparations is genuinely impressive pharmaceutical knowledge. It shows that medieval people weren't just randomly throwing substances at problems. They understood that different delivery routes had different properties. They understood that you could achieve effects through multiple means. They understood that there were ways to make drugs safer or more controllable by changing how they were administered. You're in a camp with soldiers, and it's the morning before a battle. The soldiers are being distributed rations and, along with the basic food supplies, is alcohol, strong alcohol. The soldiers are drinking it. They're not getting drunk, not falling down intoxicated, but they're getting a chemical boost. They're getting warmer, braver, more agitated. They're getting stimulated, and this is deliberate. This is how medieval armies prepared soldiers for war. But alcohol wasn't the only substance available to medieval soldiers. There's evidence that military forces also used other drugs to enhance soul. Clear performance, stimulants, pain relievers, anything that would help soldiers fight harder, last longer, endure pain better. Some of these substances were cannabis. Cannabis has mild stimulant properties and can increase confidence and reduce fear. A soldier consuming cannabis before battle would be slightly stimulated, slightly less afraid, slightly more aggressive. Some military forces probably utilized this effect. Some substances were opium-based. Opium provides pain relief and a degree of euphoria. A soldier wounded in battle, if given opium, would be able to continue fighting despite the wound. The pain would be able to continue fighting despite the wound. The pain would be manageable. The fear of pain would be reduced. Some wounded soldiers fighting in medieval wars were probably operating under the effects of opium. Some substances were herbal mixtures with stimulant properties, preparations containing things like alcohol, caffeine from certain plants, and other compounds that would increase alertness and combat readiness. Here's a quirky detail that's almost hard to believe. There's evidence that some medieval military forces gave soldiers ergot-contaminated grain deliberately. Not unknowingly, deliberately. Not unknowingly, deliberately. Because ergot poisoning produces muscle spasms and convulsions. That can be interpreted as increased strength, increased agility, increased combat readiness. Soldiers eating ergot-contaminated bread would experience involuntary muscle contractions. They'd experience euphoria and altered consciousness. They'd be in a state that could be interpreted as superhuman strength or supernatural power. And from a medieval perspective, that might be valuable. Whether this actually happened or whether it's just speculation is unclear, but the fact that it was even theoretically possible shows how far medieval people would go in seeking chemical advantages in warfare. Beyond the obvious psychoactive substances, there's also evidence that medieval military forces understood the value of keeping soldiers fed, warm, and in states of mild intoxication and stimulation. It was understood that keeping soldiers alert, not too injured, not too terrified, was important, and chemical assistance toward those goals was accepted and utilized. One of the things that changed through the medieval period was the understanding of how to use substances to prepare soldiers for battle. Early medieval warfare relied partly on shock and fury, the idea of the wild berserker warrior who fights with uncontrolled aggression. Later, medieval warfare became more professionalized, more organized, and the approach to enhancing soldier performance became more systematic. You'd give soldiers specific substances at specific times to produce specific effects. The question of whether medieval soldiers were fighting while intoxicated or otherwise chemically altered is actually kind of important for understanding medieval warfare. It changes the way you think about battles. If you understand that the participants were probably under the influence of alcohol and possibly other substances, it affects the interpretation of how they fought. how they responded to orders, how they responded to orders, how they performed. There's also the question of addiction. If soldiers were regularly given substances, they might develop dependency. A soldier who had been given opium regularly for pain management might find it difficult to function without it. An army would have to keep supplying the substance to keep the soldiers operational. This creates an interesting dynamic where the army becomes responsible for maintaining soldiers' substance dependencies. The use of substances in military contexts also raises questions about power and consent. To what extent were soldiers choosing to consume these substances versus being required to consume them as part of military service? What extent were soldiers aware of what they were consuming and what its effects would be? Some of this gets into darker territory. There's evidence that some military forces have historically used substances to make soldiers more obedient, less likely to question orders, more aggressive. Medieval forces might have deliberately chosen substances for these properties. Keep your soldiers slightly intoxicated, keep them stimulated, keep them primed for aggression, and they'll be easier to control and more effective in combat. What's clear is that medieval warfare was not conducted by sober soldiers making rational decisions. It was conducted by soldiers in various states of chemical alteration. The substances included alcohol primarily, but probably also opium, cannabis, herbs, and potentially other more exotic compounds. The soldiers were intoxicated, and that intoxication was deliberate and strategic. The military use of substances in medieval Europe probably connects back to military practices in earlier periods and in other parts of the world. Many warrior cultures have used consciousness, altering substances, as part of preparation for war. Medieval Europe was participating in a long historical tradition of using chemistry to enhance warrior performance. You're now in a physician's room, and he's holding a patient's arm. On the arm there's a cut. Blood is flowing out. The physician is letting it flow. This is bloodletting, one of the most characteristic practices of medieval medicine, and in some cases, the bloodletting is being combined with something else. Mercury. Bloodletting was based on the theory of the four humors. If you had too much blood, or if your blood was too hot, or if you were suffering from a condition that involved excess of a humor, the solution was to drain blood out of your body. This would rebalance your humors. This would cure you. It was the low pick of the time, and it was practiced constantly. But here's where it gets into darker territory. In some cases, especially for treating certain conditions like syphilis, medieval physicians would combine bloodletting with mercury treatment. Mercury is a powerful and powerfully toxic substance, taken internally or applied topically. It's a neurotoxin and a kidney toxin, but medieval physicians believed it could cure syphilis. So they'd give mercury to patients with syphilis, but they'd also bleed them regularly, convinced that the combination of bloodletting and mercury would rebalance humors and cure the disease. The effect of this treatment would be that the patient was being poisoned slowly with mercury while simultaneously losing blood. Some patients would die from the mercury poisoning. Some would survive the mercury poisoning, but be left with chronic neurological effects and kidney damage. Some might actually recover from syphilis, though the cure would have come despite the treatment, not because of it, but would be damaged by the mercury. The medieval understanding of this was that the doctor was doing everything possible to cure the disease. The patient accepted the poison because the alternative was syphilis, which would eventually kill them anyway. It's a genuinely dark calculus. Would you rather have syphilis or be poisoned with mercury? Some patients chose the mercury. Some chose the syphilis. Many didn't have a choice. They were poor. The disease had progressed, and whatever option was available, they took. Here's the quirkiest and worst detail. Some medieval physicians actually believed that the poisoning was necessary. They thought the patient needed to experience side effects of the mercury in order for it to work. They thought that if the patient wasn't becoming ill from the mercury, then the mercury wasn't strong enough, or the dose wasn't high enough. They'd increase the dose to produce more obvious symptoms. They were intentionally trying to poison their patients as much as they could tolerate, convinced that this was necessary for the cure. This goes beyond misunderstanding. This is actively making things worse while believing you're helping. The patient is experiencing all the terrible effects of mercury poisoning, and the doctor thinks that's good. That's the treatment working. That's how the cure happens, What's remarkable and horrible is that some patients did survive this treatment. Some survived the mercury poisoning with long-term damage, but without acute death. Some might have even recovered from syphilis despite the mercury, because their immune system eventually dealt with the infection, and those survivors could report that they'd been treated with mercury and survived. That evidence would be interpreted as confirmation that mercury works. It would lead to more mercury being used, more patients being poisoned, more of them surviving or dying. The combination of bloodletting and mercury represents medieval medicine at its most actively dangerous. It's not just that the treatment doesn't work, it's that the treatment actively harms while the doctor believes it's helping. The patient is being harmed in pursuit of a cure that isn't actually coming from the harmful treatment. What's also notable is that some medieval physicians actually questioned whether all of this was necessary. There are medical texts from the period where physicians raise concerns about whether bloodletting is always appropriate, whether mercury is truly effective. But the doubts didn't translate into stopping the practice. The tradition was too strong, the theory seemed too logical. So bloodletting and mercury treatment continued. The use of mercury also shows medieval awareness that toxic substances could have medicinal effects. Mercury was known to be toxic. Medieval physicians knew this, but they also believed that toxic substances could cure diseases. So the toxicity became part of the treatment. The patient had to endure the poison to get the cure. This mindset that poison could be medicine, that harming the patient could be healing, is genuinely concerning. But it shows how far medieval medicine was willing to go in trying to treat serious diseases. Syphilis was a genuinely terrible disease. It would kill you if left untreated. The idea that poisoning yourself might prevent the worst poisoning of syphilis had a certain logic to it, even if it was ultimately a choice between different kinds of death. You're in a medieval household, and there's an infant crying. The baby won't stop crying. The mother is exhausted. She's been awake for hours. The baby's got some condition that makes it cry constantly. Colic, probably. Or some kind of pain or discomfort. And the mother does something that would horrify modern parents. She gives the baby opium, just a small dose. A few drops of laudanum in a little water or mixed into the baby's porridge. The opium hits the baby's system. Within minutes, the baby is calmer. Within an hour, the baby is drowsy. The baby falls asleep. The mother can finally rest, and nobody thinks this is wrong. Nobody intervenes. This is just what you do. Medieval parents gave opium to babies and young children constantly. Not all parents, obviously, and not for every baby, but it was common enough that it was accepted, normal, part of the standard toolkit of parenting. The substance was available. The effect was immediate and obvious. The baby would stop crying, so you used it. The long-term effects of this chronic opium exposure in infants and young children during periods when their brains were developing rapidly would have been profound. Opium exposure during childhood affects brain development. It affects addiction potential. It affects long-term neurological function. Medieval children exposed to regular opium would have developed differently than children not exposed. But nobody understood this. Nobody saw this as a problem. The baby cried. You gave it opium. The baby stopped crying. That was the entire calculation. There's also evidence that some mothers gave opium to children, not just for medical purposes, but deliberately to make them easier to manage. If you could give your child small amounts of opium throughout the day, the child would be calmer, less active, less demanding. It would be easier to care for. And in the context of the medieval household where you might have had 6 or more children, where resources were limited, where the demands on a mother were intense, the temptation to use opium for manageability is obvious. This raises genuinely dark questions about medieval childhood. Were medieval children addicted to opium? Were they developing with opium in their systems? Were parents deliberately creating drug-dependent children to make them easier to control? The evidence suggests the answer is probably yes to at least some of these questions, at least for some families. What's also notable is that there was no legal or moral prohibition against this. Nobody arrested parents for giving opium to their children. Nobody condemned them morally. It was understood as medicine. It was understood as a reasonable parenting strategy. It was normal. The opium-exposed medieval children would have grown up and become opium-exposed medieval adults. They'd have had some degree of dependency, some tolerance. They'd have lived their entire lives under the effects of opium, and they would have probably passed on the practice, giving their own children opium the same way they'd been given it. This creates a picture of medieval society where icy opium exposure was transgenerational and universal among some populations. Children born to mothers who used opium might have been exposed in the womb. They'd be given opium as infants. They'd continue to receive it throughout childhood. They'd use it as adults. By the time they became adults, they'd have no idea what consciousness without opium felt like. Their baseline would be opium intoxicated. The neurological effects of this would have been significant. Opium affects brain development. Chronic opium exposure during critical developmental windows affects how the brain forms, how neurons develop, how neurons mirror systems form. Medieval children exposed to opium would have developed neurologically differently from children not exposed. What's also terrible about this is that nobody understood they were doing harm. Parents gave opium to their children because they believed it was medicine, because they believed it helped their children, because the practice was normalized and accepted. They were poisoning their children's brains during development while believing they were caring for them. The irony is that from a modern perspective, we see child opium exposure as obviously harmful. We have legal protections against it. We have understanding of how it affects development, but medieval people couldn't have had that understanding. They worked with what they knew, and what they knew was that opium made babies stop crying, so they used it. This is one of the most tragic aspects of medieval drug culture. It was affecting people who couldn't consent to it, who couldn't resist it, who would have their brains and bodies shaped by it. And it was all happening with good intentions, with what people understood to be good parenting and good medicine. You're now in a different kind of space, not a monastery or a physician's office or a marketplace, but the workshop of an alchemist. The space is filled with strange equipment, retorts and alembics and furnaces. There are strange materials, minerals, metals, plants. The alchemist is trying to do something that seems completely impossible. Turn base metals into gold. The philosopher's stone, a legendary substance that can transform base metals into gold and supposedly grant immortality. Alchemy, from a modern perspective, seems like pure fantasy. The idea that you could transform lead into gold chemically is simply wrong. It's not going to happen. No amount of heating and distilling and combining is going to produce gold from lead. But here's the thing. In pursuing this impossible goal, alchemists actually accidentally discovered real chemistry. They discovered new compounds. They discovered extraction methods. They discovered that heating and cooling substances changed their properties. They discovered that combining substances in certain ways produced new substances with new properties. They didn't understand it in terms of modern chemistry, but they were doing chemistry, and along the way, they created medicines. They created psychoactive substances. Some of them were probably genuinely useful. Some were probably useless or actively harmful. But the process of trying to achieve the philosopher's stone led to the development of pharmacological knowledge. There's evidence that some alchemists were deliberately working with psychoactive substances. They were trying to create substances that would produce visionary experiences, that would facilitate spiritual advancement, that would somehow connect them to the divine. They were using their alchemical knowledge to manipulate plants, to extract compounds, to create new preparations. Some of the legends about alchemy involve substances that sound a lot like drugs. The elixir of life, supposedly created by the philosopher's stone. Supposedly created by the philosopher's stone. Supposedly granting immortality. Sounds like a hallucinogenic drink. Some alchemists might have been creating such drinks and understanding them through the frame of alchemical legend. What's also interesting is that alchemists occupied a strange social position. They weren't official physicians. They weren't official trained, but they had knowledge, and they had the ability to create substances. Some nobles employed alchemists specifically because they believed alchemists might have access to special medicines or special knowledge. One of the most famous alchemists, Jabir ibn Hayyan, known as Guba in the Latin West, was a Muslim scholar who made contributions to chemistry, but who also claimed to be working on the philosopher's stone. His work influenced European alchemists. His methods influenced European pharmaceutical and alchemical practice. The relationship between alchemy and medicine is complicated. Alchemy was partly about pursuing the impossible, turning lead to gold, achieving immortality, to stone, achieving immortality. But it was also partly about practical chemistry, creating medicines, extracting compounds, understanding how substances interacted, and that practical work had genuine results, even if the philosophical goals were never achieved. Some alchemists seem to have understood that they weren't going to turn lead to gold, but continued the work anyway, because the practical knowledge they were developing was valuable. Other alchemists seem to have genuinely believed they were on the verge of achieving the philosopher's stone. The line between delusion and dedication is blurry. There's also evidence that some alchemists were deliberately creating drugs or drug-like substances, creating wines or oils or other preparations that had psychoactive effects, understanding them through the frame of alchemy as attempts to create substances with transformative or transcendent properties. What's clear is that alchemy, whatever its metaphorical or spiritual goals might have been, involved the actual creation of substances that could be ingested or applied, substances that could have effects, and through the process of pursuing impossible goals, alchemists discovered real chemical principles and real substances. Historians still argue about how much to credit alchemists with actual pharmaceutical innovation. On one hand, some alchemical work was probably genuinely useful and genuinely contributed to pharmaceutical knowledge. On the other hand, a lot of alchemical work was probably either useless or actively harmful. Attempting to create something that couldn't exist chemically, using toxic substances in combinations that would poison anyone who consumed them. But the bottom line is that medieval alchemists were experimenting with substances. They were heating and cooling and combining and distilling. They were creating new compounds. Some of those compounds had effects. Some of those effects were therapeutic, and through the pursuit of the philosopher's stone, they accidentally helped develop the foundational knowledge of chemistry and pharmacology. You're thinking now about something that's both mundane and profound. Pilgrimage. Medieval people took pilgrimages constantly. They traveled to sacred sites, to places where holy people had lived or died, to places where miracles were supposed to have occurred. And one of the motivations for pilgrimage was to be healed. A person would be sick or in pain or suffering from some condition that wouldn't go away despite medical treatment. They'd decide to make a pilgrimage to a shrine. They'd travel sometimes for weeks or months to the location of the shrine. They'd arrive at the shrine, pray, spend time in the sacred space, and sometimes they'd report being healed. The condition would improve. The pain would go off. The person would be cured. Now, from a modern perspective, we might assume this was all placebo. The person believed they'd be healed, so they felt better. The power of belief creating a perception of healing. But what if some of those shrines actually had substances that were helping? There's evidence, circumstantial but suggestive, that some medieval shrines might have been associated with plant-based medicines. Some shrines were places where specific plants grew. Some shrines had waters that supposedly had healing properties. Water could carry minerals or other compounds with pharmacological effects. Some shrines distributed substances to pilgrims, blessed oils or herbs, or other preparations that might have had genuine medicinal properties. And what if, this is more speculative, some of the relics the pilgrims traveled to touch weren't actually the bones or clothing of saints, but were actually psychoactive plants? What if a shrine that was famous for producing miraculous healings and visions was actually a location where people were consuming psychoactive herbs or other substances that produced the experiences they attributed to the saint's power? This is speculative, but it's not unreasonable. Pilgrims traveled to shrines expecting miraculous healing. They expected to have profound experiences. If they consumed a psychoactive substance while at the shrine, or if the shrine's water or air contained compounds that affected consciousness, they would experience altered consciousness. They would experience altered consciousness. They would interpret that altered consciousness through the frame of religious expectation. They would believe they were being touched by divine grace. And when they felt better, partly from the actual pharmacological effect, partly from placebo, partly from the rest and reduced stress of pilgrimage, they would attribute it to the saint's power. The shrine would develop a reputation for miraculous healing. Pilgrims would travel from farther away. The shrine would become prosperous. Priests or caretakers of the shrine would benefit. And the reputation would persist even if the actual mechanism was that pilgrims were consuming or being exposed to psychoactive substances. This changes how you think about medieval pilgrimage culture. It wasn't just psychology. It might have involved actual pharmacological effects. Medieval pilgrims might have been intentionally or unintentionally consuming drugs at pilgrimage sites. There's also the question of what kinds of substances might have been present at shrines. Certain plants grew in certain locations. Some pilgrimage sites were in regions where specific medicinal or psychoactive plants were abundant. Frankincense and myrrh were involved in many religious sites. The incense burned during religious services would have contained compounds that could affect consciousness. What's also interesting is that some of the most famous miracles at pilgrimage sites involved healing of conditions now recognized to respond to placebo effects or to psychoactive drugs. Psychological conditions like depression or anxiety would respond to both placebo and to drugs. Pain would respond to both. Certain neurological conditions would respond to both. Certain neurological conditions would respond to psychoactive drugs. The combination of pilgrimage with all its elements of travel, expectation, ritual, sometimes fasting, sometimes consumption of special substances, creates a context where psychoactive effects could be amplified. The person is already in an altered mental state from the journey, from the emotional intensity, from the spiritual expectation. If they consume a psychoactive substance on top of that, the effects would be intense. They would absolutely feel like they were having a miraculous experience. Historians still argue about whether pilgrimage sites deliberately use descents, substances, to enhance the pilgrimage experience. But the possibility exists, and it changes how we understand medieval pilgrimage culture, not as pure psychology, but as potentially involving actual chemical alteration. You're now in a very dark place in medieval history, a place where some of the drug knowledge we've been discussing was weaponized. You're in a context where people use poisons, where people use drugs deliberately to harm others, where the same substances that could heal were used to kill. Medieval poisoning was real and apparently somewhat common. Medieval poisoning was real and apparently somewhat common. A person would want someone dead, a rival, an enemy, a political competitor. So they'd go to someone who knew poisons. They'd request a substance that would kill, and they'd receive something, some preparation, some powder, some substance that could be slipped into food or drink. What substances would be used for poisoning? Well, the ones we've already discussed. Hemlock, aconite, the tropane alkaloid plants. These were super toxic substances that could be fatal in small doses. These were perfect for assassination. You'd create a preparation that was easy to administer and that would kill the person who consumed it. But there was also a middle ground. Substances that wouldn't necessarily kill, but would make someone sick, would incapacitate them, would make them unable to function. Cannabis in high doses could produce extreme paranoia or panic that might incapacitate someone temporarily. Various herbs could produce nausea and vomiting that would leave someone unable to act. You could poison someone without killing them, just make them unavailable for a crucial moment. There's also the question of whether substances were used to make people suggestible, to make them unable to resist, to basically pharmacologically incapacitate consent. There's evidence that some substances, possibly cannabis, possibly certain herbs, were used for this purpose. Someone would be given something without their knowledge. They'd become unable to resist. They could be harmed, and they might not even fully remember what happened because they were in an altered state. This is genuinely dark. This is medieval society using drug knowledge as a tool of harm. And it happened because the same knowledge that could heal could kill. The same apothecary who sold medicines also sold poisons. The same herbalist who could create pain relievers could create assassin's weapons. Legal systems tried to restrict access to the most dangerous substances. Some jurisdictions had laws about who could sell poisons and under what circumstances, but enforcement was difficult. The substances themselves were also medicinal. Hemlock had medicinal properties if used carefully. Aconite could be used medically in very small doses, so restricting access was complicated. There's also evidence that some medieval states experimented with toxins as weapons. Not widespread probably, but there are records of poisoning being used in warfare, of wells being poisoned, of substances being introduced into food supplies as acts of war or terrorism. One of the ways that poisoning was prosecuted was by accusing the poisoner of witchcraft. A person poisoned with an exotic substance, dying in strange ways. This was attributed to witchcraft. The person who had poisoned them was accused of witchcraft, and the accused person might be executed not for poisoning, but for witchcraft. This creates a situation where poison and witchcraft become conflated. Someone was killed by poison, an actual chemical substance applied carefully by someone with specific knowledge. But the explanation for the death was witchcraft, and the knowledge of poisons was reframed as supernatural knowledge, as communication with demons, as genuine witchcraft. Historians still are about how much actual poisoning was happening versus how much was imagined or falsely accused. But there's definitely evidence that poisoning was real. People died from known poisons. Some of those deaths were deliberate. Some people specifically used pharmaceutical knowledge as a tool of murder. What's also interesting is that the same substances that were used for murder were also available as legitimate medicines. The apothecary selling hemlock for pain relief was selling the same substance that could be used to poison someone. The line between medicine and poison was literally just the dose and the intention. This creates an interesting ethical problem for medieval practitioners. If you're an apothecary or herbalist or physician, you have access to substances that can kill. People come to you asking for medicines. How do you know if they're actually asking for medicines or asking for poison? How do you prevent your knowledge from being used for harm? Some practitioners probably took this seriously. Some probably refused to provide their most dangerous substances except in specific circumstances. Some probably kept careful track of who was buying what. But some probably didn't care. Some probably sold poisons deliberately, probably took money from people who wanted to harm others. And the knowledge of poisons, like all knowledge, could be transmitted. An apprentice learns from a master not just how to make medicines, but how to make poisons. The knowledge becomes part of the tradition. It passes from person to person, from generation to generation. Medieval poisoning is not widely discussed compared to witchcraft, but it was probably responsible for some significant number of deaths. It's a reminder that drug knowledge can be used for harm as well as healing. And in the medieval period, that harm was real. You're in the year 1348 and the world is ending. The Black Death is spreading through Europe, killing vast numbers of people. The mortality is staggering. Entire villages are dying, children dying, women dying, men dying. No escape, no cure. And in this context, people are using every substance available to try to stop it or treat it. The Black Death changed medieval drug use. It created desperation. People would try anything. They would use substances that they wouldn't normally use. They would experiment. They would risk poisoning themselves with powerful drugs because the plague would kill them anyway. At least maybe the drug would help. At least there was a chance. Medieval physicians faced with plague patients had a familiar problem. Plague was killing people and nobody understood why or how to treat it, so they threw their entire arsenal of medicines at it. Laudanum was prescribed. Cannabis was prescribed. Theriac was prescribed. Exotic preparations were created. Anything that might possibly help was used. Some of the drugs that were used were genuinely psychoactive. Patients with plague would be given substances that altered their consciousness. This might have been to reduce suffering. It might have been to induce visionary experiences that were interpreted as divine. It might have just been desperation. Use the strongest drugs available and hope something helps. There's also evidence that plague-affected areas experienced outbreaks of religious fervor, mass visions, behavior that would be recognized as collective hysteria. Some of this was probably psychological response to horror and death, but some of it might have been enhanced by drug use. If everyone in a village is suffering, if everyone is using whatever medicines and pain relievers are available, if everyone's consciousness is slightly altered by psychoactive substances, told, then shared religious experiences and shared interpretations of experiences would be inevitable. The plague years also saw an increase in the hunting of people believed to be witches or to be deliberately spreading the plague. Some of these hunts targeted people who were known to be herbalists or healers. The assumption was that witches or poisoners had caused the plague. The people killed in these witch hunts were sometimes people whose only real crime was having pharmaceutical knowledge that people didn't understand. The plague also created opportunities for charlatans and conmen, people claiming to have cures for plague, selling useless or harmful substances at enormous prices, becoming rich. While people died, the desperation created a market for fake medicine and false hope. What's also notable is that some medieval physicians continued to use substances like bloodletting and mercury treatment, even during the plague, convinced that these methods that worked for other diseases would work for plague too. They were poisoning their patients while the plague was killing them. The drug use that increased during plague years. The increased consumption of laudanum, the use of cannabis, the use of herbal preparations, was happening because people were desperate. They would try anything, and many of those substances were psychoactive. Many of them altered consciousness, and the altered consciousness for people dying or watching their families die might have provided some relief from the psychological horror of the situation. The plague years also saw changes in what was available. Some substances became scarce because merchants weren't traveling. Some substances became more valuable because they were rare. Supply chains were disrupted and people had to work with what was available locally. For some people, the plague created access to drugs they might not have had before. If you were a survivor in a plague-ravaged area, there might be abandoned supplies, medicines left behind by the dead, substances that you couldn't normally access, but that were now available. You'd use them because what did it matter? You were likely to die anyway. The Black Death marked a turning point in some ways. It showed the limits of medieval medicine. It showed that all the knowledge and all the medicine couldn't actually stop a major epidemic. And that realization that all the knowledge and all the medicine couldn't prevent catastrophic death created a kind of despair that shaped European culture. But it also meant that in the plague years, medieval people were using more drugs, more substances, more consciousness, altering compounds than they might have in normal times. The desperation created experimentation. The experimentation created both deaths and discoveries. You're in the late medieval period now, the 1400s and 1500s, and the world is slowly changing. The Renaissance is beginning in Italy. Scholars are recovering ancient texts. Knowledge is beginning to spread in new ways, and in this context, something is starting to shift in how educated people think about medicine and about substances. The first skeptics are appearing. People who are looking at the accepted medical practices and wondering whether they actually work. Physicians who are questioning whether bloodletting is truly beneficial. Scholars who are reading ancient medical texts and noticing that the ancient authors didn't agree with each other, that medieval interpretations might be wrong. And among the things being questioned is the use of substances. Some physicians were beginning to wonder whether all the medicines being prescribed were actually doing anything, whether opium truly cured disease or just masked symptoms, whether the exotic preparations were worth their cost, whether some of the treatments were actively harmful. This is the beginning of the end of the medieval pharmaceutical system. Not the end, obviously. Opium and other substances would continue to be used for centuries, but the beginning of the questioning, the beginning of the realization that maybe the medieval medical system had fundamental problems. What's remarkable is that even as skepticism began, the use of substances continued. New substances started arriving from the New World. Tobacco, which Europeans understood as having medicinal properties, and which would be integrated into European medicine. New substances meant new drugs, new pharmaceuticals, new consciousness, altering compounds entering the European arsenal. The printing press, invented in the mid-1400s, started spreading medical knowledge in new ways. Texts that had been available only in expensive hand-copied versions were now being printed and distributed. This democratized knowledge, but also meant that bad ideas spread as easily as good ones. Entire populations could read texts claiming that certain medicines worked and then try them and have different results. The Renaissance expansion of trade meant new substances arriving from new places. Spices from Asia, plants from Africa, later plants from the New World. Each new substance had the potential to be integrated into the medical system, to be used as a drug, to have effects on consciousness and on health. Preet. As a drug, to have effects on consciousness and on health. But the philosophical shift was important. The assumption that ancient authorities were always right began to be questioned. The assumption that the theory of humors was correct began to be questioned, and gradually the framework for understanding and using substances changed. The old medieval pharmaceutical system was being replaced by something that would eventually become modern medicine. This transition happened slowly. It took centuries. In the 1500s and 1600s, medicine was still largely medieval in its approach, but the cracks were starting to show. The systems that had seemed coherent and complete for centuries were being questioned. And during this period of transition, consciousness-altering substances were still being used constantly. Opium was still the basis of pain management. Alcohol was still the basis of pain management. Alcohol was still everywhere. Cannabis continued to be used. New substances were being incorporated. But the context was changing. The understanding was changing. The certainty was being replaced by questions. One of the things that started being questioned was why medieval people had accepted substance use so readily. Why had there been no moral panic about drugs? Why had consciousness-altering substances been so normalized? Some of the emerging thinkers started to suggest that maybe there had been something wrong with this. Maybe substances shouldn't be used so casually. Maybe the normalization of altered consciousness wasn't actually healthy. But that critique wouldn't fully develop until much later. For now, in the Renaissance, substances continued to be used. The system continued to function even as some of its premises were being questioned. What's clear is that the medieval period of casual, normalized, utterly ubiquitous drug use was beginning to end. A new period was beginning, one that would eventually lead to the criminalization and demonization of drugs, to the war on drugs mentality. But that future was centuries away. For now, the transition was still happening. You're at the end now. You're thinking about all of this, all the opium and alcohol and mandrake and belladonna, all the apothecaries and healers and wise women, all the monks and soldiers and noblewomen, all of it. And the deepest realization is this. Your medieval ancestor probably got high more often than you do. They probably altered their consciousness more regularly. They probably had more access to psychoactive substances, more normalization around their use, more integration of consciousness-altering drugs into daily life. Think about it. Your medieval ancestor woke up. They drank small beer, weak alcohol with breakfast. During the day, they had more alcohol. If they were sick or in pain, they had laudanum. If they were anxious, they had cannabis available. If they wanted to transcend reality, they had multiple options. If they were a woman, they might be using cosmetics that poisoned them slowly. If they were a soldier, they were chemically prepared for battle. If they were a monk, they were incense-intoxicated during prayers. If they were a child, they received opium for pain or just to keep quiet. Consciousness-altering substances were ambient. They were normal. They were medicine. They were food. They were just part of existing in the medieval world. The medieval person's baseline consciousness was probably subtly different from that of a modern person, shaped by regular opium exposure, by constant alcohol consumption, by incense and other environmental psychoactive compounds. And here's the thing that should make you think. Medieval people had no concept of addiction in the modern sense. They didn't have a moral framework that condemned drug use. They didn't have legal systems that criminalized it. They just used substances. When something worked, they used it more. When they became dependent, they accepted that as normal. They continued to use the substance, and they built their entire culture around that normalized use. What changed? Partly it was knowledge. As science advanced, people understood better what these substances actually did, how they affected the brain, what the long-term consequences were. Partly it was cultural shifts. Moral frameworks changed. The idea that altering your consciousness was sinful or weak began to spread. Partly it was economics and power. Making drugs illegal created ways for governments to control populations, for law enforcement to maintain order, for wealthy people to maintain status, by distinguishing themselves from drug users. But the reality is that human beings have always used consciousness-altering substances across cultures, across time periods. Human beings have found plants that change consciousness and used them. The medieval period was no exception. The medieval period was actually an example of this as a mainstream, normalized practice. Not hidden, not shameful, not illegal, just normal. And when you really think about it, that's remarkable. The medieval ruler managed to create a functional society, churches, governments, courts, armies, economies, while being regularly intoxicated. They did it. People were high and they still built cathedrals and created art and wrote theology and maintained complex political systems. It worked, or at least it worked enough. What that tells you is that consciousness-altering substances don't necessarily destroy societies or make civilization impossible. Medieval Europe was heavily drug-using, and it functioned. The relationship between substance use and social function is more complicated than the simple narratives about drugs destroying everything would suggest. Your medieval ancestor lived in a fundamentally different chemical reality than you do. Their baseline consciousness was altered. Their expectations were different. Their approach to pain and anxiety and spiritual experience was mediated through substances that modern people would be shocked to take. And they were fine with this. They weren't suffering, or desperate, or shameful about it. It was just how things were. And here's the final thought. The substances they were using weren't invented in the 1960s or created in laboratories. They were plants. They were the products of evolution. Opium came from poppies. Cannabis came from cannabis plants. Mandrake grew in the earth. These substances have been used for millennia. Medieval people were participating in a tradition that stretched back to ancient Egypt, to ancient Mesopotamia, to human history itself. They were using what nature had provided, and their cultures had evolved around that use. The shame and fear around drug use is actually fairly recent. It's only a few centuries old. For most of human history, consciousness-altering substances were normal. Medieval people lived in that normal world. They knew no other way. So when you think about medieval people getting high, don't think of it as shameful or backward or sad. Think of it as just different. A different world, a different relationship with consciousness, with pain, with anxiety, with the nature of being alive. But medieval people got high like it was normal, because for them, it was. They built a world on that foundation, and it worked. As you're drifting now into the quiet space where sleep is beginning to call, let yourself release all the images we've explored together tonight. Let go of the monasteries and the apothecaries and the crowded medieval streets. Let the weight of all that knowledge, all that history, all those centuries of consciousness, altered existence, altered existence, existence, altered existence, existence, altered existence. Your body is heavy. Your breathing is slow and easy. The medieval world is far away now, a distant echo of towers and bells, and the sound of people living in a chemical reality so different from your own that it seems almost like a dream. Let it become a dream. Let it dissolve into the darkness. Imagine, if you wish, the gentle sensation of falling backward through time, through centuries, through generations, through the lives of all those ancestors who understood something fundamental about consciousness that we've perhaps forgotten. They knew that the mind could be changed. They knew that plants held power. They knew that altered consciousness wasn't something to fear, but something to integrate, to use, to make part of the fabric of living. Your eyelids are so heavy now. The world is so soft. Let sleep come.
You've journeyed far tonight through poppy fields and monastery candlelight, through markets where apothecaries weighed mysterious powders, through the quiet rooms where healers mixed their preparations. You've walked in the shoes of people living an entire different kind of consciousness, and now you can rest, feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort, into the safety of your own space, your own time. Let the medieval world fade completely now. Let sleep take you gently without struggle. You're safe, you're warm. The journey is complete. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let yourself drift into the quiet darkness where dreams begin. Good night, traveler. Sleep well. Tomorrow, you'll wake in your own time, your own world, your own unaltered consciousness. But for now, rest. Rest deeply and peacefully, with the knowledge that human beings have always been seekers, always been explorers of consciousness, always been builders of worlds around what makes them feel less alone, less afraid, less in pain. The social fabric of altered consciousness, beyond the individual experience of pain relief or visionary escape, medieval drug use was woven into the very fabric of society. It shaped how communities coped with disaster, how families managed the relentless grind of poverty and illness, and how people understood their place in a world that was often brutal and unforgiving. To truly grasp the medieval mind, we have to accept that their baseline was not our baseline. Their normal was chemically softened, their realities slightly blurred at the edges, their anxieties muffled by generations of inherited pharmacological knowledge. Consider the village festival, a harvest celebration, a saint's day, a wedding. What did it look like? There was music, dancing, food, and always drink. Barrels of ale were tapped, wineskins passed around, and before long, the entire community was in a state of mild to moderate intoxication. Children played among the adults, sipping from cups, their laughter slightly too loud, their coordination slightly off. Elderly couples leaned against each other, eyes glazed, memories drifting. Young men and women paired off with the reckless confidence that alcohol provides, and if someone had brought along a little laudanum or a few pie seeds mixed into a cake, no one batted an eye. It was all part of the celebration. The boundary between medicinal and recreational was so thin, it barely existed. In times of grief, the same substances offered solace. A child died of fever. A husband was lost in a farming accident. A mother succumbed to childbirth. The community would gather, and someone would bring out the calming herbs, the poppy syrup, the strong wine. The bereaved would drink, and for a few hours, the sharp edge of loss would dull. They would sleep, and in sleep they would find respite. This was not seen as talby or weakness. It was seen as necessary care. Grief without relief was a slow death. Medieval people understood that the body and mind needed help to survive tragedy, and they used the plants around them to provide that help. Even in the courts of law, altered consciousness played a role. Judges and juries were not immune to the ambient intoxication. A defendant's behavior might be excused if he had been drinking. A witness's testimony might be discounted if she had taken medicine. And yet, because everyone was in a similar state, these judgments were made within a shared chemical framework. The standard was not sobriety, but relative coherence. As long as you could speak and stand, you were considered functional. The bar for impaired was set much higher than it is today. This normalization extended to the church as well. Priests and monks, as we have seen, were regular consumers of wine and incense. Some of the most revered religious experiences of the Middle Ages, visions of the Virgin, ecstatic trances, angelic visitations, may have been accompanied by psychoactive substances. Does that make them less genuine? That depends on your definition of genuine. The experience was real to the person who had it. The feelings of divine presence, the sense of peace, the conviction of being touched by something greater, these were not manufactured by the plant alone. The plant opened a door, but the person walked through it, and the theological interpretation gave meaning to the chemical event. Medieval spirituality in this sense was not separate from pharmacology. It was deeply intertwined.
What about crime and violence? Did the constant use of alcohol and opium make medieval people more aggressive or more passive? The evidence is mixed. Alcohol, as we know, can lower inhibitions and increase aggression in some individuals. But in a society where violence was already a common tool of conflict resolution, it's hard to isolate the effect of the substance. Opium, on the other hand, tends to reduce aggression, promoting sedation and apathy. A population mildly sedated by poppy juice might be less likely to revolt, more accepting of hardship, more willing to endure the status quo. Some historians have speculated that the widespread use of opium in medieval Europe contributed to the stability of the feudal system. Whether that was intentional or accidental is impossible to say, but the correlation is intriguing. One of the most overlooked aspects of medieval drug use is its role in women's lives. Women were the primary caregivers, the ones who administered medicines to children, who prepared herbal remedies for theft, household, who managed the health of the family. They were also the primary consumers of many psychoactive substances, both for their own ailments and for the emotional labor of sustaining a family in difficult times. A mother who gave her crying infant a few drops of laudanum was not a bad mother. She was a tired mother, a desperate mother, a mother who had no other tool to quiet the child so she could tend to the fire, the other children, the endless chores. The same mother might take a small dose herself to get through the night, to stop her own hands from shaking, to find a moment of peace in a life that offered few. We should not romanticize this, but we also should not judge it through modern lenses. She did what she could with what she had. The dark side, of course, is that this normalization also enabled exploitation. Unscrupulous individuals could use drugs to incapacitate victims for theft, assault, or worse. The same herbs that eased pain could be used to cloud judgment and remove consent. Medieval legal records contain scattered references to such crimes, though they are often folded into accusations of witchcraft or simple assault. The line between medicine and poison was not just a matter of dose, it was also a matter of intent, and intent could be hidden. As we move into the early modern period, the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation brought new moral scrutiny to many aspects of daily life, including drug use. Protestant reformers criticized the excesses of monastic drinking. Catholic authorities cracked down on folk healers who used magical plants. The witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries swept up countless women whose only crime was knowing too much about herbs. The medieval openness to psychoactive substances began to close. What had been normal became suspicious. What had been medicine became magic, then heresy, then crime. By the 18th century, opium was still used, but with growing concern about addiction. By the 19th century, the first drug laws appeared, targeting not the substance itself, but the populations associated with it. And by the 20th century, the war on drugs had transformed a millennia-old human practice into a global system of prohibition and punishment. The medieval world, with its frank acceptance of altered consciousness, began to seem not just different, but alien. And yet, if we step back, we can see that the medieval approach was not naive. It was pragmatic. It recognized that human beings suffer, that pain is real, that anxiety is debilitating, that sleep is precious, and that plants can help. It did not have the language of neurochemistry, but it had the wisdom of experience. The medieval person knew that a poppy seed pod, carefully scored, produced a milky sap that could quiet a screaming baby, ease a dying man's last hours, or allow a soldier to stand after being wounded. They knew that fermented grain could make the cold less bitter, the dark less frightening, the company of strangers more bearable. They knew these things because they had tested them, generation after generation, and found that they worked. In our own time, we have rediscovered some of that wisdom. Cannabis is being legalized for medical and recreational use. Psychedelics are being studied for treating depression and PTSD. Opioids are still the gold standard for severe pain, though we now struggle with addiction and overdose. The difference is that we have separated the medicine from the ritual, the stance from the community. A medieval person took laudanum in the context of a relationship with an apothecary, a family, a community that understood its effects. Today, we take pills in isolation, prescribed by a doctor we barely know, with little understanding of the plant from which the drug derived. We have gained safety and lost connection. We have reduced overdose deaths, and increased loneliness. The medieval world was not better. It was dirtier, more dangerous, more uncertain. But it was also more honest about the role of consciousness, altering substances in human life. They did not pretend that they could live without them. They did not create a false divide between the medicine that heals and the drug that intoxicates. They accepted the ambiguity and did their best to navigate it. As you settle into the stillness of this night, let that acceptance wash over you. There is no need to judge the past or to romanticize it. There is only the quiet recognition that human beings, across all ages, have sought relief from suffering. They have reached for plants, for brews, for the fruits of the earth. They have found comfort in altered states, and they have built civilizations on that foundation. You are the inheritor of that long tradition, whether you know it or not. Every time you take a sip of wine to unwind, every time you drink coffee to wake up, every time you accept a painkiller after surgery, you are participating in the same ancient practice. The plants have changed, the chemistry is better understood, but the impulse remains. So let the medieval world fade now. Let the poppies close their petals, the ale barrels empty, the incense smoke drift away. You are here, in your own time, your own body, your own breath. You have traveled through centuries of altered consciousness and returned to yourself. There is nothing more to do tonight. No more mysteries to solve. No more histories to absorb. Just the gentle rhythm of your breathing, the soft weight of your limbs, the growing darkness behind your eyelids. Let go of the last thought. Let go of the need to understand everything. Let the stories you have heard become like distant bells, fading into silence. You are safe. You are warm. The world outside is still, and within you, a deep rest is waiting. Do not resist it. Do not hold on. Simply exhale and allow yourself to slip into the quiet. Good night, dear friend. Sleep without dreams. Sleep without dreams, or with dreams that comfort. Wake tomorrow with the knowledge that you have walked through a world where pain was met with poppies, fear with fermentation, and the long night of existence with the humble wisdom of plants. And now you rest. Rest fully, rest deeply, rest without guilt or worry. The past is past. The future is not yet. You are exactly where you need to be. Good night, and rest.